I didn't plan on it being a problem. At first, everything was perfect, just a simple weekend camping trip to clear my head. I had read some good reviews about the spot, a remote area just off the beaten path, away from the usual crowds. Peaceful, secluded, perfect. I had everything packed, and the weather was forecast to be clear and crisp. I was ready to enjoy the quiet. It was going to be one of those trips where you could almost hear your thoughts echoing in your own head. I set up camp in the late afternoon. The sun was low, casting a soft orange glow across the thick forest that surrounded me. I chose a spot near a small creek. Nothing too far from the trail, but enough to feel like I was alone. The sound of the water trickling over the rocks was calming. I started with the basics, setting up my tent, gathering some dry firewood, and getting my cooking gear ready. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, I had a small fire going and a cup of coffee brewing on my portable stove. The warmth of the fire felt good, and the quiet of the wilderness was a welcome contrast to the constant noise of the city. I had packed a good meal for the night, something simple but satisfying. As I sat there eating, I couldn't help but feel like something was off. The air felt heavier somehow, not in a bad way, but it was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. It's hard to describe. I've been camping many times before, but this time felt different. The shadows in the trees seemed deeper, more alive. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. It wasn't like I was unfamiliar with the woods. I'd camped in places much more remote than this before. As the night wore on, I settled into my sleeping bag, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the world. I lay there staring up at the sky through the thin fabric of the tent. The stars were stunning, so clear, so bright, but something kept pulling at the back of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was silly, right? I was alone. There was no one else out here, just me and the wild. But that feeling wouldn't go away. I tried to distract myself by focusing on the sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the occasional chirp of an insect, the croak of a distant frog. It wasn't long before I drifted off to sleep, the fire outside slowly dying down into a soft glow. I don't know what woke me up in the middle of the night. It wasn't the wind or an animal. No, this was something different. There was a soft noise outside my tent. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling through the trees, but then it stopped, and I heard it again. A soft step, like someone or something was walking around my campsite. The crunch of dry leaves underfoot. Slow, deliberate. I lay still, my heart pounding in my chest. My first thought was that it was another camper. Maybe someone else had set up a tent nearby, though I hadn't seen any signs of other people when I arrived. But then I remembered reading that this area was remote, almost no foot traffic. It seemed unlikely. I told myself to relax, that it was probably just an animal. But the noise didn't stop. It continued in a slow, rhythmic pattern, circling my camp. I had no way of knowing how long it went on. It felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. My mind raced with possibilities. I grabbed the small flashlight beside me, trying not to make any noise as I reached for it. I slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peek out, holding my breath. The darkness outside was thick, the firelight barely reaching the edge of my campsite. My eyes scanned the shadows, but I saw nothing. No figure, no movement, just trees, rocks, and the flickering light of the dying fire. I pulled the zipper back up and sat there in the silence. It took a while before I managed to calm my nerves enough to close my eyes again. It wasn't anything, I thought. I was just tired. Maybe a bear had come close or some curious animal. Whatever it was, it didn't matter. The forest was full of creatures doing their thing. I had to let it go. But sleep didn't come easy after that. Every creak of the tent, every rustle of the trees made my muscles tighten. The feeling that I wasn't alone was back. more intense than before. It wasn't just the noise anymore. It was the stillness, the oppressive weight of the forest around me. I tried to convince myself I was just being paranoid. After all, it was just a few strange sounds. Nothing more. When dawn finally broke, I was relieved. The pale light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the campsite. The night had felt endless, but now everything seemed more normal. The forest was quiet again, still. No more strange noises. I crawled out of the tent, stretching and shaking off the remnants of my unease. But when I stood up, I froze. Something wasn't right. The campfire had burned out during the night, leaving only a pile of ash and charred wood. Nothing strange about that, but the fire pit was surrounded by a circle of footprints, not animal prints, but human-sized, faintly visible in the soft dirt. They were all over the ground, too many to count, scattered in a way that made no sense. Some of them led right up to my tent. I quickly stepped back, my heart sinking into my stomach. I wasn't imagining things. Someone had been here. I checked the rest of my campsite, my eyes darting to every shadow. There was no sign of any person now, no trail, no gear left behind, nothing. The forest stood silent as if nothing had happened. I felt a surge of panic rush through me, but I took a deep breath. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe someone had passed through, someone who had a similar setup, or maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the more I looked at the prints, the more uneasy I felt. They were too close, too deliberate. I didn't want to stay here any longer. The idea of packing up and heading back to the car seemed like the best thing to do. I didn't care if I had to hike for hours, anything to get away from this place. So, I packed up quickly, trying to ignore the feeling that someone was still out there, watching me from the trees. I didn't stop to look around too much, just grabbed my gear and shoved it into my bag. When I was almost done, I heard a sound, a twig snapping, not far from me. I froze again, my heart pounding in my chest. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my things and sprinted down the trail, not looking back. The path was winding, rocky, but I didn't care. I needed to get out. Every sound in the forest felt like it was closing in on me, every crack of a branch echoing through my head. I didn't stop until I reached the parking lot. My car was still there, just like I had left it. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it without even thinking. My breath came in ragged gasps. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone following me from the trees, but the lot was empty. The forest was quiet again, nothing but the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. Still, my gut told me to keep driving, to get as far away from that place as possible. I started the engine, not caring that I hadn't even checked the back of my car or the area around it. I needed to leave. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. It seemed too strange, too out there to explain. No one would believe me, and honestly, I wasn't sure what I had experienced myself. But one thing I knew for sure, there was something about that place. Something that I didn't understand, and I wasn't ever going back. I always loved camping. The outdoors, the quiet, the fresh air. It was my escape. That weekend, I had planned a solo trip, something I hadn't done in years. I wanted to disconnect, to truly experience nature without the distraction of other people or technology. I chose a remote spot deep in the woods, away from any established campgrounds. It wasn't an easy trek, but that's what made it exciting. I had all my gear packed, and I set off early in the morning, the sun just beginning to rise. The hike to the campsite was exhausting, but I enjoyed it. The forest around me was dense, with thick trees that blocked out the sun, leaving everything bathed in an eerie half-light. The path was uneven, and the dirt was soft from recent rain. As I walked, the only sounds I heard were the crunching of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle of an animal in the brush. It felt peaceful, though there was a certain tension in the air, the kind you get when you're all alone in a place so far from civilization. Around noon, I reached the clearing I had chosen. It was perfect, flat, open, with a small stream nearby. I set up my tent and made a fire. The crackling of the flames was soothing as I sat by it, eating a quick lunch. Afterward, I decided to explore the area a bit. The woods felt different, though. Not in any supernatural way, just off. Like there was something about this place that wasn't quite right. Something I couldn't put my finger on. The air felt heavy, and the sounds of the forest seemed too muted, as if everything was holding its breath. I shrugged it off. It was probably just my imagination. After all, I'd been in the woods countless times before. I wandered deeper into the trees, keeping the stream in sight. I came across a small rock formation, which seemed interesting, so I climbed up to get a better view. From the top, I could see for miles, nothing but trees and the occasional break in the forest where I could spot distant hills. Then something caught my eye, a small structure. It wasn't big, maybe the size of a shed, but it was tucked away among the trees in an area that didn't seem to be a natural part of the landscape. It was hidden by the brush, almost as if someone didn't want it to be found. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. I carefully made my way toward it, my footfalls silent on the forest floor. As I got closer, I saw that it wasn't a shed at all, but a small, dilapidated cabin. The wood was weathered and decayed, the roof sagging under the weight of years of neglect. There was no door, only a broken frame that led into a pitch-black interior. The windows were shattered, and the remnants of old furniture, what little was left, lay scattered inside, barely visible in the gloom. I stood at the threshold, peering inside. There was something unsettling about it, the kind of place you instinctively know to avoid. But I had already come this far, so I took a step inside, my flashlight illuminating the dark corners. The air inside was thick, stale with the scent of rot. I shivered despite the warmth outside. The place felt like it had been abandoned for years. There were remnants of a fire pit in the center, charred wood, and ashes scattered around the floor. But what really caught my attention was the strange symbol etched into the wall. It was crude, hastily scratched into the wooden planks. It looked like a circle with lines extending outward, almost like a sun, but the lines were uneven, jagged. There was something about it that sent a chill down my spine. I wasn't sure why, but I felt an overwhelming urge to leave. I turned around to head back to the clearing when I froze. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move in the trees just beyond the cabin. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but as I focused, I saw no creature, just the movement of the branches. A wind had picked up, but the air felt still, unnaturally so. I didn't want to stick around to figure it out. I quickly exited the cabin and started heading back toward the clearing. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched, like something was lurking just beyond my vision. The rustling of the leaves behind me seemed louder now, closer, almost as if something was following my every step. When I finally made it back to the clearing, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The familiar sight of my tent and the fire calmed my nerves. But as I sat down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was as though the forest had changed. The sounds of the animals had stopped, the wind had died down, and even the light seemed dimmer. The feeling of being watched never left me. As night fell, I sat by the fire, poking at the coals, trying to push the unease out of my mind. I couldn't explain why, but everything felt off. Every rustle of the trees, every snap of a twig felt like a warning, like something was waiting for me just beyond the firelight. I stayed up late, hoping the feeling would pass, but it didn't. The longer I sat there, the more paranoid I became. I kept checking my surroundings, looking for any movement in the darkness. but all I saw was the flickering light of the fire and the endless shadows of the trees. Around midnight, I heard it. Faint, distant sound. A whispering, low and unintelligible, like the wind was carrying voices through the trees. I strained to listen, but it was gone as quickly as it came. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, but then I heard it again, this time closer. My heart began to race, and I stood up, scanning the darkness. Nothing. I decided to check the area around the campsite just to be sure. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking around the perimeter of the clearing. The woods felt even darker now, the trees pressing in from all sides. I swept the beam of light through the shadows, trying to reassure myself that everything was fine. But then I froze. There, just at the edge of the trees, was something standing in the darkness. It was tall, almost unnaturally so, and its shape was indistinct, blending with the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, but I could feel it watching me, studying me. I quickly looked away, my breath catching in my throat. The air had gone cold, and I had the unmistakable sensation that whatever it wasn't alone. I backed away slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears. The whispering started again, faint but unmistakable, echoing through the trees. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, as if trying to communicate something important. Panic set in, and I bolted toward my tent, not looking back. I dove inside, zipping the flap shut behind me, my hands shaking. My flashlight flickered as I looked around, but nothing was there. The woods were still, too still. I sat in the darkness, trying to calm my breathing, telling myself that it was just my imagination, just the isolation getting to me. But I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. It was hours before I finally managed to drift off to sleep, though I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up to strange noises, the feeling that someone or something was just outside the tent, waiting. Each time, I'd shine my flashlight toward the entrance, but nothing was ever there. By morning, I was exhausted and on edge. The sun had risen, but it did little to lift the weight of fear that had settled over me. I knew I needed to leave. Something wasn't right about that place. The woods had changed, had become dangerous. I packed up my gear in a hurry, barely taking the time to organize anything. I had to get out, had to get back to civilization. I didn't care about anything else. The hike out was long and grueling, my muscles aching from the tension of the past night. But the further I went, the more I felt the pressure lift. When I finally made it back to the main trail, I stopped to catch my breath. It was over. I was safe. I didn't know what had happened, what I had experienced, but I knew that I never wanted to go back there. As I walked toward my car, the thought crossed my mind. Maybe I had just been imagining things. Maybe the isolation had gotten to me, but I knew deep down that whatever I felt in those woods, whatever had been watching me, wasn't my imagination. I left the forest behind, and for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. But I couldn't shake the thought that I wasn't the only one who had left the woods that day. The air was crisp when I arrived at the campsite. The forest stretched endlessly, dense with towering pines and maples, their canopies blocking out most of the sky. I had planned this solo camping trip for weeks, craving a break from the suffocating grind of city life. There's a kind of silence in the wilderness that feels alien when you're used to car horns and distant chatter. But that's exactly what I wanted: peace, isolation, and the chance to reconnect with something primal. I parked my car at the trailhead and hoisted my pack onto my shoulders. It was heavier than I remembered, but I figured the discomfort was worth it. The hike to my chosen campsite was about 3 miles, mostly uphill. The trail was narrow but well-worn, winding through dense underbrush. I kept my pace steady, enjoying the rhythm of my boots crunching against the dirt. Around me, the forest buzzed with life, birds calling, leaves rustling, insects humming. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the ground. The spot was perfect, a flat area surrounded by trees, with a small stream trickling nearby. I dropped my pack with a grunt and got to work setting up camp. First, the tent, a two-person dome I'd used a dozen times before. I hammered the stakes into the soft earth and tightened the guy lines, making sure everything was secure. Then, I gathered rocks to build a fire ring and scouted the area for dry wood. The act of preparing my little slice of the wilderness felt grounding, almost meditative. As the sun disappeared completely, the temperature dropped quickly. I lit the fire, its warmth and light a comforting barrier against the encroaching darkness. Dinner was simple. A can of chili heated over the flames, accompanied by a few crackers. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet and the stars that began to appear overhead. The forest at night is a different world. The sounds change. Distant hoots and the occasional rustle replaced the daytime chatter. I felt small and insignificant, but in a good way, like I was part of something vast and timeless. After dinner, I cleaned up meticulously, not wanting to attract any wildlife. I hung my food bag from a tree branch well away from my tent, a precaution I'd read about in countless guides. With the fire reduced to glowing embers, I crawled into my sleeping bag, exhaustion washing over me. The ground was hard despite the foam pad I'd brought, but I didn't mind. Sleep came easily. I woke up suddenly, heart pounding. For a moment, I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep. The tent was pitch black, the kind of darkness that presses against your eyelids. I stayed still, listening. At first, all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat. Then faintly there was a sound, a snapping twig, followed by the crunch of leaves. Something was moving outside. My mind raced. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon. I'd read about how active animals were at night, but the sound didn't feel random. The steps were deliberate, slow, as if whoever or whatever it was trying to be quiet. I reached for my flashlight, fumbling with the zipper of my sleeping bag. The beam of light cut through the darkness as I shone it toward the tent wall. The noise stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear anything over the blood rushing in my ears. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Finally, I convinced myself it had been nothing, an overactive imagination fueled by isolation and too many survival stories. I turned off the flashlight and forced myself to lie back down. Sleep was harder to come by this time, and when it did, it was fitful. The next morning, everything felt normal again. The forest was alive with birdsong, and sunlight filtered through the trees in golden beams. I stepped out of the tent, stretching stiff muscles, and walked to the stream to splash water on my face. The cold was bracing, and I felt silly for letting myself get so spooked the night before. Then I saw the tracks. They were faint but unmistakable, pressed into the soft mud near the edge of the clearing. Human footprints, bare feet. My stomach tightened as I stared at them. They weren't mine. The size was different, smaller, and I'd been wearing boots since I arrived. I crouched down, examining them more closely. The prints led away from my camp, disappearing into the underbrush. I'm not a tracker, but I could tell they weren't fresh. Maybe a day old, 2 at most. Still, the sight of them unsettled me. Who else would be out here barefoot? The rational part of my brain tried to dismiss it. Maybe a hiker who'd gotten lost or a free spirit wandering the woods. But deep down, something felt off. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. I stuck close to camp, gathering wood and exploring the immediate area. I didn't want to stray too far, not with those footprints lingering in the back of my mind. By evening, I'd convinced myself again that I was overreacting. The forest was vast. The odds of running into someone out here were slim. That night, I built a bigger fire. The flames crackled and danced, casting flickering shadows against the trees. I stayed up later than usual, reluctant to retreat to the confines of my tent. But eventually, fatigue won out. I doused the fire, double-checked that my food was secure, and crawled into my sleeping bag. The sound woke me again, this time louder. Footsteps, close to the tent. My breath caught as I listened. They were heavier than the night before, more purposeful. Whoever it was, they were circling my campsite. I reached for my flashlight but hesitated. Did I really want to reveal myself? The footsteps stopped, and I heard something else. A low, guttural noise, almost like a growl but unmistakably human. My skin crawled. I'd heard about people living off-grid in the wilderness, avoiding society entirely. But those stories felt distant, something you'd read about in a magazine or hear on a podcast. This was real, immediate, and happening right outside my tent. I clenched the flashlight tightly, debating my next move. Should I shout, try to scare them off, or stay silent and hope they left? My heart hammered as I decided to do neither. Instead, I slowly unzipped the tent, just enough to peer out. The firelight from earlier had faded, leaving only pale moonlight to illuminate the clearing. I saw nothing, just trees and shadows. The footsteps had stopped completely, and the silence was deafening. I scanned the area, my eyes darting from one shadow to the next. Then, in the corner of my vision, a flicker of movement. My stomach dropped as I realized it wasn't an animal. A figure, partially hidden behind a tree, was watching me. They didn't move, just stood there, barely visible in the darkness. My hands trembled as I zipped the tent back up, trying to control my breathing. Whoever they were, they knew I'd seen them. I grabbed the small knife I kept in my pack and held it tightly. It felt woefully inadequate, but it was better than nothing. The hours dragged on, each minute stretching into an eternity. I didn't hear the footsteps again, but I knew they were still out there, waiting, watching. My mind raced through every possibility. Were they just curious? Or was this something more sinister? I didn't dare sleep, my grip on the knife never loosening. When dawn finally broke, I stepped out of the tent, my muscles stiff from tension and lack of sleep. The clearing looked the same as it had the day before, but it felt different. The air was heavier, the forest less inviting. I didn't waste any time packing up my gear. Every sound, every movement in the trees set my nerves on edge. As I hiked back to the car, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure following me. But the trail remained empty. By the time I reached the trailhead, my legs were shaking, partly from exhaustion, partly from relief. I threw my pack into the car and climbed in, locking the doors behind me. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Even now, writing this, I'm not sure what I encountered out there. A lost hiker? Someone living off the grid? Or something darker, more dangerous? I'll probably never know. But one thing is certain, I won't be camping alone again anytime soon. It started as a simple weekend plan. I needed a break from the chaos of my life. Work, deadlines, the noise of the city. So, I packed up my gear, loaded it into my car, and drove out to a remote campsite about 2 hours away from town. The place wasn't a popular spot. It wasn't marked on any official camping maps. I'd read about it on a hiking forum. A quiet stretch of forest with a small lake at the center, perfect for solitude. The drive was uneventful, though the further I got from the city, the quieter it became. The hum of traffic faded, replaced by the whisper of the wind through the trees and the occasional chirp of a bird. By the time I turned onto the narrow dirt road leading to the campsite, it felt like I was the only person left in the world. I parked at a small clearing and started unloading my gear. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the sun filtered through the canopy above, casting dappled patterns on the forest floor. The trail to the lake was about a mile long, winding through dense woods. My pack was heavy, but the walk wasn't too bad. The forest was beautiful, untouched, and alive with subtle noises. The rustle of leaves, the distant gurgle of water, and the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. I was completely alone, and it felt oddly freeing. When I reached the lake, it was exactly as described: small, still, and surrounded by trees. The water reflected the sky like a mirror, broken only by the occasional ripple from a jumping fish. I found a flat spot near the shore to set up my tent. It took me about half an hour to get everything ready. The tent pitched, my sleeping bag laid out, and my small camping stove set up for dinner later. The first few hours were peaceful. I explored the area a bit, walking along the lake's edge and into the surrounding woods. There was no sign of anyone else, no footprints, no trash, nothing. It was just me and the wilderness. As the sun began to set, the forest transformed. The light shifted to a deep orange, then faded to gray as shadows stretched long and the temperature dropped. I built a small fire near my tent and cooked some instant noodles. The warmth of the flames and the simple meal were comforting. By the time night fully settled in, the forest was pitch black. I'd brought a flashlight, but its beam felt weak against the overwhelming darkness. The fire crackled softly, its light flickering across the trees. I sat there for a while, staring into the flames and listening to the sounds of the forest. It wasn't entirely silent. I could hear the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, and the distant croak of frogs near the lake. It wasn't until I climbed into my tent that I started to feel uneasy. It's hard to describe exactly why. Maybe it was the way the wind seemed to die down completely, leaving the air still and heavy. Maybe it was the faint sound, a distant snapping of twigs that didn't seem to fit with the usual noises of the forest. I told myself it was just an animal. There were plenty of deer in these woods, maybe a raccoon or a fox. Nothing to worry about. I tried to sleep, but it didn't come easily. The thin walls of the tent made every noise outside seem amplified. I could hear the water lapping gently at the lake's edge, the occasional rustle of leaves, and every so often, that same snapping sound. It was closer now, or at least it felt closer. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me, but my heart wouldn't stop racing. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of something brushing against the side of the tent. My eyes shot open, and I froze, holding my breath. The sound was faint but unmistakable. A soft, scraping noise, like something or someone dragging a hand or a branch along the fabric. I reached for my flashlight, my hand trembling. When I turned it on, the tent's interior lit up, casting shadows on the walls. The noise stopped immediately. I waited, straining to hear anything else. Minutes passed, maybe longer, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no rustling, just the distant sound of the lake. Eventually, I convinced myself it must have been the wind or an animal brushing past. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I stayed awake for hours, clutching the flashlight, listening to the oppressive silence outside. The rest of the night was uneventful, though I didn't sleep much. By the time dawn broke, I was relieved to see the first rays of sunlight piercing through the trees. The forest felt less intimidating in the daylight. I stepped out of the tent, stretching and taking a deep breath of the cool morning air. Everything looked the same as it had the day before, as if the night's unease had been nothing more than a bad dream. But then I noticed something. Just a few feet from my tent, the ground was disturbed. The dirt and leaves looked as if they'd been pushed aside, forming a narrow, shallow groove that led off into the woods. It wasn't an animal trail. It was too deliberate, too straight. My stomach turned as I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It looked like something had been dragged. I'll admit I considered packing up right then and there, but a part of me didn't want to give in to fear. I told myself it could still be explained. Maybe a deer had stumbled and slid through the dirt. Maybe I'd done it myself while setting up camp and just hadn't noticed. I decided to stay, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The rest of the day was uneventful. I went for a hike, sticking to the trail I'd come in on. I didn't wander far, keeping the lake within sight most of the time. I didn't see or hear anything unusual, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Every so often, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder or stopping to listen to the forest, convinced I'd heard something out of place. But there was never anything there. That night, I built another fire, larger this time, and stayed up later than I had the night before. I wanted to exhaust myself, hoping it would help me sleep. The firelight felt like a barrier against the darkness, but I knew it wouldn't last. When I finally crawled into my tent, I kept the flashlight within arm's reach. The night was worse than the first. The noises started again. Soft rustling, the occasional snap of a twig. Each time, my heart pounded in my chest, but I stayed still, listening, waiting. At one point, I thought I heard faint footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving just outside the tent. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. The sound stopped, and after what felt like an eternity, I finally dared to move. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside, shining the flashlight into the darkness. There was nothing there. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I stepped out of the tent, my body stiff and my mind racing. I was ready to leave, but when I looked around the campsite, my blood ran cold. Near the edge of the lake, just visible through the trees, was a small pile of rocks stacked neatly in a cairn. I hadn't seen it the day before, and I knew I hadn't put it there. That was it. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. The walk back to the car felt endless. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed like it could be something or someone lurking. When I finally reached the clearing where I'd parked, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I threw my gear into the car, started the engine, and didn't look back. Even now, I can't explain what happened. Maybe it was all in my head, the product of an overactive imagination and the isolation of the woods. Or maybe someone really was out there watching, waiting. I'll never know for sure, but one thing is certain. I won't be camping alone again anytime soon. I never thought a simple camping trip would turn into a nightmare. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway. Just me, the woods, and the peace I so desperately craved. The days leading up to the trip had been stressful. Work was piling up, and my relationships felt strained. I needed solitude, a break from the city, from people. I thought the forest would be a perfect place to clear my mind. I packed my gear, checked the weather, and made sure I had everything I'd need. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water, flashlight, and a first aid kit. I headed out on a Friday afternoon, planning to drive to a remote campsite I'd read about online. The place was off the beaten path, a secluded spot nestled deep in the woods, far from the noise of civilization. I was ready for peace. The drive took longer than I expected. The roads narrowed as I got farther from town, the trees on either side growing thicker and more imposing. The silence outside was suffocating, like the world was holding its breath. My GPS lost signal long before I reached the campsite, but I wasn't too concerned. I had a map. It was old, but it would do. When I arrived, the parking lot was empty, just the way I liked it. I grabbed my backpack and walked the short trail to the campsite. The trees here were dense, and the air felt cooler, like the forest was its own world. I set up my tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and made a simple dinner over the fire. As the sun sank below the horizon, I couldn't help but feel a sense of calm wash over me. The sounds of the forest, crickets, rustling leaves, and the occasional call of an owl were soothing. Felt like I had the whole place to myself. I settled in for the night, reading a book by the firelight. The flames crackled and popped, and the warmth of the fire was comforting against the cool night air. After a while, I went to bed, crawling into my sleeping bag. The forest was quiet now, save for the occasional branch snapping in the distance. I closed my eyes and drifted off to sleep, hoping for a peaceful night. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something. It wasn't the wind or an animal. It was steps, slow, deliberate, like someone was walking around my campsite. I froze, listening intently. My heart raced, but I tried to calm myself. It was probably just a deer or some other animal. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. The area around my tent was empty. No one was there. I shrugged it off, telling myself I'd imagined it. But as I lay back down, I heard it again, this time closer. The sound of someone walking, just outside the edge of the light. My breath caught in my throat. I held the flashlight up, trying to peer out of the tent, but the beam didn't reach far enough. I lay still, straining to listen, but the footsteps stopped. The silence was unbearable. Minutes passed, and I started to relax, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But just as I was about to drift back to sleep, I heard something else, a soft tapping on the side of my tent. It was light at first, but then it got louder, more insistent. Someone or something was at my tent. Panic surged through me. I reached for the knife I kept in my bag, my hand trembling. The tapping stopped, replaced by a deep, guttural growl. It sounded like an animal, but it wasn't quite right. My stomach churned, and I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. I couldn't move, couldn't think. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do. Should I yell for help? But who would hear me? I was alone in the middle of nowhere. The growling continued, getting louder, closer. I held my breath, praying that whatever it was would go away. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. I didn't dare move for what felt like hours, listening to the stillness of the forest around me. But nothing else happened. I eventually drifted off to a restless sleep, the memory of those footsteps and the growl haunting me. The next morning, I woke up exhausted. I forced myself out of the tent and gathered my things to start the day. The sky was gray, clouds hanging low, but it didn't seem like rain was coming. I checked the area around my campsite. There were no tracks, no signs of anything unusual. It was as though nothing had happened, but I knew what I had heard. I wasn't imagining it. I decided to go for a hike, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. I followed a narrow trail that wound deeper into the woods, the trees thick above me, blocking out much of the light. As I walked, I noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet. Normally, the woods were filled with the sounds of birds, squirrels, and insects. But today there was nothing. The absence of noise made my skin crawl. I continued on, trying to push aside the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. I eventually came across a small clearing. At the center was an old, decaying log, and scattered around it were rocks, some of them stacked in odd formations. It struck me as strange, but I shrugged it off. Maybe other hikers had been there before me, but something about the scene unsettled me. I decided to take a break and sat on a nearby rock, staring into the trees. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves above me. It wasn't long before I heard a snap behind me, a twig breaking. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I stood up, my heart racing again. I wasn't alone. I made my way back to the campsite, my steps quickening. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I walked, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I finally reached the clearing where I'd set up my camp, I felt a slight relief. But that relief was short-lived. The air around the campsite felt different, heavier. My fire pit, which I had left unattended, was now disturbed. The rocks that had once surrounded it were scattered around, as if someone had kicked them. My tent, which had been securely zipped up, was now wide open. I had clearly closed it before I left. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I knew I needed to leave, but I couldn't just pack up and run without figuring out what was going on. As I stood there, gathering my thoughts, I heard it again, the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from behind the trees. My blood ran cold. There was no one here. I was alone, but someone or something was moving in the woods around me. I grabbed my backpack and made a decision. I needed to get out of there, fast. I didn't care if I left behind some of my gear. I just wanted to get to my car and leave. I sprinted down the trail, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I pushed through the underbrush. The sounds of footsteps followed me, echoing through the woods. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew someone was there. I dared not look back. My mind raced with thoughts of what might be out there. Was it another person? A wild animal? Or was it something worse? I didn't stop running until I reached the parking lot. My car was still there, and I wasted no time throwing my gear inside. I slammed the door shut and started the engine, my hands shaking. The moment the car was moving, I felt a sense of relief. I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. But the road was empty. As I drove away, the forest growing smaller behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had barely escaped something. It wasn't just the footsteps or the growl. It was the knowledge that something had been watching me, something that was not supposed to be there. The woods were vast, and not everything within them was as peaceful as I'd hoped. When I got back home, I told no one about what had happened. I didn't think they would believe me. I didn't even want to believe it myself. But the strange thing was, the fear didn't leave me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something out there, something in those woods that I had disturbed. I haven't been camping since. I've always been the kind of person who loved the outdoors. Camping, hiking, and just being out in nature. There's something about the silence, the fresh air, and the feeling of being far from civilization that makes everything else seem unimportant. So when I decided to take a solo camping trip, I thought it'd be the perfect escape. A chance to unwind, clear my head, and just be with my thoughts. I picked a spot deep in the woods, far from any popular trails. It was a place I had heard about from a friend who mentioned it offhand, but no one ever seemed to go there. I figured that would be perfect. The last thing I wanted was to hear someone else's noise, or worse, run into other campers. I wanted complete isolation. I packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, and set off on foot. The trail was rough, overgrown in places, and it took longer than I expected to get to the campsite. The deeper I went, the more the forest closed in on me. The trees stood tall and thick, their branches blocking out most of the sunlight, leaving the ground underfoot damp and soft. It wasn't eerie at first, just peaceful in its quietness. But the further I went, the more I noticed the lack of animals. Normally, you'd hear birds, the scurrying of squirrels, maybe the distant howl of a coyote at night, but there was none of that here. Not even the wind made much noise. Felt oddly still. I found the clearing I was looking for by mid-afternoon, just as the sun began its slow descent behind the mountains. It wasn't much, just a flat patch of dirt surrounded by trees, but it would work. The quietness of the place made everything feel more intense, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I couldn't see anyone. It was just a gut instinct, something I couldn't explain. Setting up camp took a while, but I got my tent up, my fire pit ready, and a small campfire going before the sun dipped completely. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, as if the trees were leaning in closer, casting dark shapes that flickered with the movement of the fire. The chill of the evening air set in quickly, and I pulled on a jacket, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of my mind. That night, I ate my dinner in front of the fire, watching the flames crackle and shift. The solitude was peaceful in its own way, though I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder now and then. Every time I did, the trees seemed to be just a little darker, their branches just a little closer. I chalked it up to the isolation. It was easy to let your mind play tricks when you were by yourself. The wind picked up later, a soft breeze that barely rustled the leaves but carried with it a strange odor. At first, I couldn't place it, something earthy, but almost sour, like something decaying. I sniffed the air, but the smell didn't seem to come from anywhere specific. It lingered, though, hanging in the space around me, making my stomach churn. By the time the fire had burned down to embers, the wind had died down completely. The silence returned, but now it felt different, more oppressive. I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was like I was being watched, even though there was no one in sight. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but every rustle in the underbrush, every shift of the trees felt like something was moving just beyond the edge of my vision. I decided to retreat into the tent for the night. It wasn't even late, only around 9 p.m., but the cold, the quiet, and the strange feeling in the air made me want to sleep. I climbed into my sleeping bag, zipped it up tight, and tried to relax. But sleep wouldn't come. I kept hearing noises, soft creaks, like branches moving. At one point, I even thought I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, like someone was pacing just outside my tent. My heart raced as I held my breath, straining my ears. But no more footsteps followed, just the normal sounds of the forest. The wind, the creaking trees. Maybe it was just my nerves. I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Kept me up for hours, staring at the inside of the tent, waiting for something to happen. Every little sound felt amplified, from the flicker of my flashlight's dying beam to the rustling of leaves in the distance. There was no real danger, of course, but the feeling of being alone in the vast, empty wilderness, in a place where no one else ever seemed to come, made everything feel unnatural. I woke up early the next morning, shaken but alive. The night had passed, and nothing had happened. The sun was just starting to rise, casting long orange beams through the trees. It was beautiful, like the world was starting over, and for a moment, I felt foolish for letting my imagination run wild. I made some coffee on my stove and sat by the fire pit, looking out over the clearing. But something about the forest around me felt wrong. The trees seemed even thicker than before, the space between them impossibly tight. As I sipped my coffee, I noticed something strange on the ground near the edge of the clearing. A series of tracks. Large ones, like they had been made by a heavy animal. But they weren't animal tracks. They were human-shaped footprints. There were only a few, and they didn't lead anywhere specific. Just a random collection of prints that seemed to appear out of nowhere. I stood up slowly, my stomach tightening. I circled the clearing, looking for more evidence, but I couldn't find anything. The tracks didn't make sense. The ground was soft enough for the footprints to sink in, but they didn't continue anywhere. They were just there. That's when I felt it again. The pressure, the sensation of being watched. I tried to ignore it and pack up quickly. I didn't know why I was rushing, but every second I spent there made me feel like I was intruding on something. The trees, the wind, the air itself. It all felt like it was pressing in on me, closing me off from the outside world. I grabbed my backpack and started walking, not taking the trail this time, but heading deeper into the forest, hoping to find a way out. The further I went, the more disorienting everything became. The trees seemed to close in around me, and the trail I had followed in the previous day had disappeared completely. My phone had no signal, and without a clear path, I was relying on the sun to guide me, but it wasn't helping. I was lost, and the sense of dread only grew stronger with every step I took. The woods seemed to stretch on forever, as if they were alive, shifting around me. By midday, I was starting to panic. There was no sign of any trail, and the odd feeling that something was following me was getting worse. My breath was coming in short gasps now, and my mind was racing. What had I stumbled into? Why did everything feel so wrong? I stumbled upon a small stream, and for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Water meant life. It meant I was on the right track. I followed the stream downstream, hoping it would lead me to something, anything familiar. Hours passed, and just when I thought I couldn't go any longer, I heard a voice, a distant, muffled sound, like someone calling out. It wasn't much, just a faint echo, but I ran toward it, praying it was someone else, someone who could help. The sound led me to a small cabin, tucked away in a hollow, hidden by the trees. It wasn't much, a rundown shack with a rusted tin roof, but it was shelter. I knocked on the door, my hand shaking. When it opened, an older man stood there, looking me up and down with a kind but wary expression. He didn't say anything at first, just motioned for me to come inside. I stepped in, grateful for the warmth and safety, but still unsettled by the silence of the place. "I'm lost," I said, my voice hoarse. "I don't know how to get out." He nodded slowly, then pointed to the window. "You're not alone out there," he said, his voice quiet. "The woods, they change people. They change the land. Be careful." I didn't understand at first, but as I looked out the window, I saw the shadows stretching longer across the clearing outside, and for the first time since I had arrived, I felt the weight of the forest pressing down on me. I wasn't alone anymore, but in that moment I wasn't afraid. I had found help, and I was no longer lost. The woods had given me what I needed, a way out, even if it was just a temporary one, and that was enough. I never thought camping could be so unsettling. I've done it dozens of times, weekends in the woods with a few friends, quiet nights by the campfire, and the usual laughs around a few beers. But this trip, alone in the backwoods, away from the usual trails and crowds, felt different from the moment I set up my tent. It was early autumn, the air crisp but not cold, with the leaves just starting to turn. The kind of weather I love, cool enough to hike but warm enough to sit outside without needing extra layers. I had gone solo, hoping for some time to reflect, to think about things in my life that had been bothering me. The campsite I chose wasn't far from where I parked my car, just enough to feel remote, but not so far that I'd have a hard time finding my way back if needed. I'd scouted the area on a map before heading out and had chosen a quiet spot near a small, trickling stream. A few trees surrounded the area, their branches weaving together to provide some natural cover. Setting up my tent went smoothly. I unpacked everything slowly, taking my time to enjoy the quiet. The sound of the stream was a perfect backdrop, and the air smelled fresh, earthy. I felt calm, relaxed, no deadlines, no stress, just me and the wilderness. By late afternoon, I had gathered a few dry sticks and twigs to make a fire. I didn't want it to get too dark before I started cooking dinner. The sun dipped low in the sky, casting a warm orange glow over everything. I lit the fire, watching the flames dance and crackle. The shadows seemed to grow longer around me, but I didn't feel uneasy. If anything, I felt at peace, like everything was in its right place. It wasn't until the light completely faded and the fire flickered out that things started to shift. I'd already eaten my dinner, and now, as the night crept on, a strange quiet settled around me. No animal noises, no birds calling from the trees. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I made sure to keep my campfire small, just enough for light and warmth. But as I sat there, staring into the dying embers, something felt off. The silence was heavy, uncomfortably so. I tried to ignore the feeling, chalking it up to the unfamiliarity of being alone in the woods. I gathered my things and climbed into my tent, zipped it up tight, and lay down on my sleeping bag. It was only then that I started to hear it, the faintest sound of something shifting in the trees. It was so subtle, so quiet, that I questioned whether I had actually heard it at all. I lay still, listening. There it was again. I wasn't sure if it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but something about it felt wrong. It wasn't the usual nighttime rustling of forest creatures. This was deliberate, almost as if someone or something was moving around the perimeter of my campsite, carefully, methodically. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just the wind moving through the trees. But my nerves were on edge now. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it through the small opening in the tent, sweeping it around the campsite. The beam of light bounced off the surrounding trees, the shadows playing tricks on my eyes. Nothing. No movement. I turned off the flashlight and tried to settle back down, telling myself it was just my mind running wild. The woods can do that to you, especially when you're alone. But the feeling didn't go away. In fact, it grew stronger. I tried to ignore it, to sleep through it, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard something again. A faint noise in the distance. A snap of a twig. A rustle of leaves. The sounds seemed to be getting closer, and I was sure now that it wasn't just animals. Someone or something was out there. My heart started to race. I had no signal, no way to call for help if anything went wrong. And the campsite was too far from the nearest road to get assistance quickly. The idea of being completely alone, vulnerable in the woods, hit me hard. I heard the movement again. This time it was definitely closer, too close. It was coming from just beyond the ring of trees surrounding my tent. I sat up, clutching my flashlight, my breath shallow. My mind raced, trying to think of anything that could explain the noises, but nothing made sense. I could hear someone breathing now. Slow, steady, almost as if they were trying to be quiet. I held my breath, praying that whatever it was would go away, but it didn't. The breathing continued, getting louder, more deliberate. And then, to my horror, I heard a faint scratching sound. Something was scraping against the side of my tent. Panic surged through me. I wanted to scream, to get up and run, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen, my mind scrambling for a plan, for anything that would make this stop. I thought about my knife. Was it still in my bag? Should I confront whatever was out there? I didn't have the answers. All I could do was listen, try to stay as quiet as possible, and wait for whatever this was to show itself. Minutes passed like hours. I stayed motionless, not even daring to breathe too loudly. My flashlight clutched in my hand like a lifeline. The scratching stopped, but the breathing remained, hovering just outside the tent. I could feel it now, whatever it was, standing there watching me. Then suddenly it was gone. The breathing ceased, the noises stopped, and all I could hear was the wind rustling through the trees again. I didn't dare move. Was it gone? Had I imagined it all? My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was a bear or some other wild animal. But no, the behavior didn't make sense. The quiet, careful movements, the way the sounds seemed to circle the camp. It was too deliberate, too intelligent. Felt wrong. I stayed in the tent, holding my breath, listening. Every minute felt like an eternity. After what felt like ages, I finally mustered the courage to unzip the tent a crack and peek outside. The area was still. The moon had risen, casting a pale light across the campsite, but nothing seemed amiss. No signs of movement, no footprints. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the perimeter with my flashlight. My heart was still pounding in my chest, my senses on high alert. There was no sign of anyone, no indication that someone had been there. I walked slowly around my campsite, checking the trees, the ground, the area by the stream. It was all undisturbed. As I stood there, trying to shake the feeling of being watched, I saw it. On the ground, near the edge of the trees, something was out of place. A small pile of branches arranged deliberately, almost like they had been placed there. I bent down and examined it more closely, and that's when I saw it. Pressed into the dirt, clear as day, footprints. Human footprints, but not normal ones. The print was deep, like the person had been carrying weight, maybe even something heavy. And that's when it hit me. Whoever or whatever had been out there watching me had been circling my camp the entire time. They'd been waiting for me to make a move, to slip up, and I'd almost given in to fear, almost stayed in my tent and let them get closer. I didn't wait around any longer. My instincts kicked in, and I started gathering my things quickly, stuffing them into my backpack. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I needed to get out of there, fast. The path back to the car wasn't far, but I had no intention of sticking around to find out who or what had been watching me. I grabbed my gear, threw on my jacket, and took off in the direction I had come from, moving as fast as I could without tripping. The forest, once peaceful, now felt like an alien landscape, every rustle and snap of a twig setting my nerves on edge. As I reached the trail, I looked over my shoulder. Nothing, no sign of movement, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. By the time I reached my car, I was exhausted, my mind racing, my body trembling. I threw my backpack into the trunk and drove off without looking back. The road was quiet, the trees lining the highway seeming far less ominous than the woods I had just left behind. When I got home, I took a long shower, trying to wash off the lingering sense of dread. But even as I settled into bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. It was as though the woods had left a part of themselves with me, something I couldn't get rid of. And to this day, I can't explain what happened out there. Maybe it was just my imagination, but every time I go hiking now, every time I set up camp, I can't help but remember the feeling of being watched in the stillness of the woods, and I wonder if something or someone was out there waiting. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend escape. Just me, the forest, and the promise of solitude. I needed a break from the stress of city life, and nothing seemed better than a camping trip to recharge. So, I packed my things the night before: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a first aid kit, flashlight, and a few other essentials. Nothing fancy, just enough to keep me going for 2 nights. I drove out to the camping site early the next morning, eager to get started. The drive took about 2 hours, just far enough to leave behind the noise of the world, but still close enough to not feel too isolated. The spot I picked was secluded, deep in the woods. It was a spot I'd been to once before with friends, but this time I was alone. When I arrived, the place seemed as peaceful as I remembered. The sunlight filtered through the canopy of trees, creating little pockets of light on the forest floor. I set up my tent near a small stream, listening to the sound of water trickling over rocks. There was no one else around, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. The day went by slowly, almost like time itself was taking a break. I spent some time walking through the woods, enjoying the fresh air and the quiet. The trees were dense, but the path I followed was well-trodden. There was a certain calmness to being surrounded by nature, and for a while it felt like everything was in perfect balance. As evening approached, I started a fire. The sun dipped lower in the sky, and the air grew cooler. I cooked some food over the flames and ate in silence, staring into the fire as it crackled and popped. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I couldn't help but feel a slight unease creeping in, but I brushed it off. It was just the stillness, I thought. I was alone and everything was fine. After dinner, I sat back and watched the fire burn down. The shadows grew long, and the sounds of the forest became more pronounced. The rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. But then, I heard something different, a sound that didn't quite fit. A faint rustling, almost like footsteps, coming from the edge of the clearing. I stood up, trying to see if I could make out what it was. My flashlight was on the ground next to me, and I grabbed it, scanning the darkness. There was nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. My heart started to race, but I told myself I was just imagining things. It had to be an animal, right? I went back to the fire, trying to ignore the feeling gnawing at me. But the rustling didn't stop. It was subtle at first, but then it became more persistent, like someone or something was moving closer. I shone the flashlight in the direction of the sound, but there was nothing there, just trees, dark and silent. I felt my stomach tighten. My instincts were screaming at me to pack up and leave, but that seemed ridiculous. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere? And why would anyone be sneaking around my camp? The night grew colder and the wind picked up. I started to feel a bit of relief as I focused on the fire, its warmth pushing back the chill. But then, something even stranger happened. I heard it again. This time it was clearer. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slowly crunching through the underbrush. I froze, listening intently. They were coming from the woods to the left of me. Whoever it was, or whatever it was moving slowly, deliberately. I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed my knife, the only weapon I had, and slowly walked towards the noise. My footsteps were muffled by the soft earth, but theirs were loud, like they were trying to make sure I heard them. I walked a little further, my flashlight held in front of me, shaking slightly from my grip. The footsteps grew louder, closer. The air was thick with tension. I stopped, holding my breath, hoping to hear a voice, a sound, anything to confirm that this was just some late-night wanderer. But there was nothing, just the sound of the footsteps, crunching leaves and twigs. I was about to turn back when a voice whispered my name. It was soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. Hey, hey. My heart nearly stopped. There was no way anyone could have snuck up on me without making more noise. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe some other campers had heard I was out here and were messing with me. But everything inside me told me this was no prank. This was something else. I backed away slowly, my eyes scanning the darkness, searching for the source of the voice. I didn't dare turn my back. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then started again, this time moving in the opposite direction. I didn't waste a second. I ran back to my tent, grabbed my things, and started packing as quickly as I could. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely tie down the tent. The fire was still crackling, but I didn't even think about it. I couldn't stay. Not now. The footsteps followed me, circling the camp, growing closer and closer. I was almost done when I heard something that made my blood run cold. A heavy thud, like something large had fallen nearby. I froze. My flashlight illuminated the ground around me, but there was nothing to see. No animal, no person, just the trees, standing like silent sentinels. I was almost finished packing when the voice whispered again, this time much louder, almost in my ear. Leave, now. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my gear and ran, stumbling over the uneven ground, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The darkness seemed to press in on me from all sides, and every rustle in the underbrush felt like a threat. I didn't care about the path anymore. I just needed to get out of the woods. I ran for what felt like hours, not stopping until I finally reached my car. My hands were so cold and numb I had trouble unlocking the door. When I finally got inside, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my heart still pounding in my chest. I sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I'd been so sure I was alone, so sure that nothing would happen out there in the woods. But now I wasn't so sure about anything. I kept looking out the window, half expecting to see someone standing just outside, watching me. But there was nothing, just the trees, dark and silent in the distance. I drove away as fast as I could, my hands still shaking on the wheel. I didn't care about the campsite, about the gear I'd left behind, or about the money I'd wasted on the trip. All I cared about was getting as far away from that place as possible. When I finally got home, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the events in my head, trying to understand what had happened. I told myself it was just a bad experience, that maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me in the isolation. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Something had been out there. Something had been watching me. I never went back to that campsite. Somewhere out there in those woods, I know I wasn't alone. And I'm not sure if I ever want to find out what or who it was. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend. My friend Ben and I had planned this camping trip for weeks. Nothing too fancy, just a couple of tents, some snacks, and a little time away from the city. We drove up to the small, lesser-known campground in the woods, far enough out that cell service would be spotty, but not so far that we couldn't get back quickly if needed. No big deal. We both loved the outdoors and had been camping before, so this was just another adventure to tick off the list. At least that's what we thought when we first set out. The air was crisp and fresh, not a cloud in the sky, and the road leading to the campground twisted and turned through thick woods, which was exactly how we liked it. No crowds, no noise, just the sounds of nature. We pulled into the campground around noon, and I couldn't help but smile at the stillness around us. There were a couple of other tents already set up, but the place was mostly empty, giving us plenty of space. We got our gear out of the trunk, setting up camp near the edge of a small clearing. Ben made a fire while I unpacked the tents. The crackling sound of the fire quickly became the background music to our afternoon as we started getting comfortable. The place had a peaceful, almost eerie quietness about it. You know, the kind of quiet where everything feels calm, but you can't help but feel like you're being watched. Just slightly? We didn't think much of it at the time. We set up our campsite like we always did, with the fire crackling between us. Ben went off to fetch some firewood, while I started on dinner. The sounds of the forest surrounded me. The distant calls of birds, the rustling of leaves as a breeze passed by, the occasional snap of a twig from the underbrush. It was peaceful, too peaceful, maybe. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and we gathered around the fire, talking about nothing in particular. The moon was just a sliver in the sky, but there was enough light to see the shapes of the trees swaying gently in the wind. I remember looking at the shadowed woods beyond our campsite, how it seemed like the trees went on forever. Then came the sound, a soft thud, followed by another and another. It was faint at first, but it was unmistakable, the sound of something large moving through the underbrush. Ben had heard it too because he stopped mid-sentence, his eyes darting toward the woods. "Did you hear that?" he asked, though we both knew the answer. I nodded slowly, my heart starting to race. The sounds were soft but steady, like something was walking just out of sight, maybe just beyond the clearing. A deer? A bear? The thought of a bear made me nervous, but this didn't sound like the normal movement of animals. It was deliberate, too deliberate. "Maybe it's just an animal," I said, trying to sound confident, but there was a tightness in my chest I couldn't shake. I looked back at the fire, as if the flickering flames could offer some sort of protection. But the thuds continued, closer now. There was something about the way they echoed that felt off, like whatever it was didn't care if we were here. Ben grabbed a flashlight from his pack, shining it in the direction of the sounds, but the beam only reached the first row of trees. Nothing. The thuds stopped abruptly. It was dead quiet again. Too quiet. My pulse pounded in my ears. "Let's just stay here for now," I said, not fully convinced, but not wanting to make things worse by wandering into the woods. We tried to shrug it off, talking more loudly, laughing at the dumb things we'd done in the past, but the tension lingered. Every time the wind rustled the trees, my eyes darted to the shadows beyond the firelight, searching for movement, but finding nothing. Eventually, we went to bed. The night was cold, and I zipped my tent up tight, but I didn't sleep. Not really. The whole time, I kept thinking about that sound, the thuds, that sense of being watched. I kept hearing things outside my tent. Twigs snapping, the soft tread of footsteps, but whenever I checked, there was nothing there, just the wind. In the early hours of the morning, I woke to a new sound. This time it was louder, clearer, the unmistakable sound of something scraping against the side of my tent. It was a slow, deliberate sound, as though something was trying to feel its way around the fabric. My heart nearly stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear it again, but all was still. I waited, my muscles frozen. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was probably just the wind again. But the sound of the scraping came again, closer this time, like whatever it was trying to find an opening. Then it stopped. I didn't move for a long time, not sure what to do. The quiet was deafening now, the kind of silence that fills your ears with the pressure of something unspoken. My mind raced through every scenario. Was it someone messing with us? Was it an animal trying to get into the tent? But I couldn't shake the feeling that something about it wasn't right. The deliberate slowness of it, the way it had paused, as if it knew I was awake. I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped the flap of my tent, poking my head out cautiously, my flashlight in hand, scanning the area. Nothing. The fire had long since died down, and the night was nearly pitch black. I didn't see anything in the clearing, but something felt off. The hairs on my neck stood up. I checked Ben's tent. It was zipped up tightly, just like mine. I stepped out into the cold, still air, keeping close to the dying embers of the fire. Every instinct told me to stay close to the light, but I felt like I had to check. I had to know. I started walking toward the edge of the clearing. The ground was soft with damp earth, and the night was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my chest. My flashlight swept through the trees, catching glimpses of the dark shapes looming around me. I was halfway through the clearing when I saw it. A figure, just at the edge of the trees, where the light from the campfire couldn't reach. It was a silhouette, just standing there, motionless. My throat tightened, and I froze, staring at the shape. It was too tall to be human, and too still to be anything natural. I didn't know what to do. My feet were rooted to the ground, my pulse hammering in my ears. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure turned and disappeared into the woods, vanishing into the darkness with a fluidity that made me shiver. I couldn't move for a long moment, but when I finally did, I rushed back to the fire, my heart in my throat. I didn't wake Ben. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to admit what I had just seen. Maybe I didn't want to scare him, but I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just sat there watching the woods around us, waiting for something, anything to happen. The morning came, and with it, a sense of relief. The sun broke through the trees, washing everything in light. Ben was up, packing up the tent, unaware of the night's events. I said nothing about what I had seen, thinking it might just be my mind playing tricks on me in the dark. I didn't want to make it real. We packed up our gear, and I couldn't help but glance one last time at the woods as we left. Everything seemed normal, too normal, but the memory of what happened was still fresh in my mind. The scraping sound, the figure in the trees. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I wasn't coming back, and I never did. had always loved the idea of camping. Just me, the woods, and the open air.
No distractions.
Just nature, fresh air, and quiet nights under the stars. So when I decided to go on a solo camping trip, I was excited. It wasn't my first time camping alone, but something about this trip felt different. Something in the air. Maybe it was because I chose a more remote spot, far away from the regular trails. I wanted peace, but I didn't realize how much solitude would come with it. I set up camp in the late afternoon, just as the sun began to dip behind the trees. I was in a small, secluded forest with no other campers nearby, or so I thought. The sky above was clear, the temperature was perfect, and the sound of a nearby stream created a peaceful atmosphere. It seemed like the perfect place to unwind. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and soon had a small fire crackling in front of me. The warmth of the flames felt good as the cool night air settled in. I sat by the fire for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest, the occasional rustle of leaves, the chirp of crickets, and the distant call of a bird. It was calming. As night settled deeper, I noticed how dark the woods were. I couldn't see much beyond the campfire's light, but I could sense the forest stretching out around me, silent and vast. There was no one else for miles, I reminded myself. The thought should have made me feel safe, but instead, it had the opposite effect. My skin prickled as I stared into the shadows, wondering what was lurking beyond the fire's reach. I wasn't the type to get scared easily, but the quiet made everything feel eerie. Every crack of a twig, every rustle in the bushes, made me jump, despite knowing there were no monsters lurking out there. It was just a rabbit or maybe a squirrel. Still, it felt unsettling. I shook my head and tried to focus on the warmth of the fire, determined not to let my mind get carried away. Later that night, after I ate, I crawled into my tent and zipped myself in, hoping for a good night's sleep. The fire had burned down to embers, but I could still hear the crackling in the distance, a reminder of the warmth just outside. But then, something changed. It started as a faint noise in the distance, a sound that seemed too deliberate to be natural. It was like a soft, rhythmic thud, as if something was walking, slowly and heavily, through the woods. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just a deer or some other animal moving through the forest. But the thudding grew louder, closer. It was no longer distant, it was like it was circling my camp. I sat up in my tent, my heart racing. I told myself it was just an animal, but the noise didn't stop. It was too steady, too rhythmic, and then I heard something else. The sound of something dragging across the ground. It was a slow, scraping noise, like heavy branches or something much larger moving in the dark. My mind raced. I tried to calm myself. The logical side of me told me it was just an animal or maybe someone else camping nearby. I wasn't alone out here after all, but something about it didn't sit right. It was too deliberate, too slow, and there was no smell of campfires, no sounds of chatter or movement, nothing that suggested there was anyone nearby. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent cautiously, shining the light around. Nothing. I could barely see beyond the small circle of light from the beam. The night seemed unnaturally still, but the sounds persisted. The rhythmic thudding, the dragging sound. I was frozen, unsure of what to do. I couldn't see anything in the trees, but my instincts told me I wasn't alone. And for the first time, I wasn't sure I wanted to be here anymore. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe there was something out there, something human. The thought sent a chill through me. I lay back down in my tent, trying to push away the fear, but the sounds continued. Eventually, I must have drifted off to sleep from sheer exhaustion. But I woke up later, drenched in sweat. The tent was shaking. Something was outside, pressing against the fabric. Not violently, but gently, like someone was feeling the outside, moving around it slowly. I couldn't breathe for a moment. My heart hammered in my chest. I lay still, hoping that if I didn't move, it would go away. The pressure on the tent grew stronger. It was like someone or something was leaning against it. I could feel the fabric shift. My breath was shallow, my mind racing. What was it? Couldn't tell. And the sounds continued, closer, louder now. I had to make a decision. I couldn't stay in that tent another second. I grabbed my backpack and flashlight, unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, and bolted into the woods. I didn't even think about where I was going, just running, desperate to get away. The woods were thick, and the moonlight barely broke through the canopy of trees. My flashlight flickered as I ran, but I didn't dare stop to fix it. I heard the thudding again, louder this time, chasing me. Whatever it was fast, faster than anything I'd ever heard. And it was right behind me. I stumbled over roots and rocks, struggling to breathe, the sound of the thud echoing in my ears. Felt like the ground was moving beneath me. The brush was thick, but I kept running, hoping I could outrun whatever it was. But then I tripped. I landed hard, the wind knocked out of me. My flashlight flew from my hand, spinning through the air before hitting the ground with a dull thud. I couldn't breathe for a moment. I pushed myself to my feet, hands shaking as I tried to find my bearings. The noise was closer now, closer than I'd ever thought possible. Suddenly, I heard a voice, a human voice. "Hey, you okay?" I froze, confused. My head spun as I looked around. There, standing in the clearing, was another camper. He was holding a rifle, looking around cautiously. "You're lucky I found you," he said, stepping toward me. "You ran right into a bear's territory. They can be dangerous, especially around here." I blinked, still in a daze. It wasn't a person chasing me. It wasn't a human at all. It was the bear, the one I had heard in the distance. It had been circling my camp, drawn by the smell of food. I hadn't realized how close I was to its territory. The man walked with me back to my camp, making sure the bear had gone before I could set up again. He explained the risks of camping near certain areas, warning me to stay clear of animal paths in the future. I couldn't believe how close I had come to disaster, but at least I had gotten lucky. The next morning, after a restless night, I packed up and left. I didn't want to stay another minute in that forest. As I made my way back to the trailhead, I looked back one last time at the woods. What had felt like a serene, peaceful place only the day before now seemed vast and dangerous. The bear had taught me a valuable lesson in respect for nature, and a reminder that sometimes the quietest places hold the most peril. That trip had been one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. But I was alive, and I would be more careful next time. The sun had just started to set when I arrived at the campsite. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. The quiet, the fresh air, and the chance to get away from everything. It was just me, the wilderness, and a tent that I had pitched under a canopy of towering pine trees. The fire crackled as I sat down next to it, trying to relax, but something felt a little off. I couldn't explain it at the time, but I chalked it up to the unfamiliarity of being alone in the woods. I had done plenty of camping before, but there was something about this particular place. The trees here were so dense, and the sounds of the forest felt different, louder, almost more oppressive. The wind whispered through the branches, and every now and then, I thought I heard a twig snap, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. I had gone hiking earlier in the day, following a trail that led deep into the woods. The path was overgrown in places, but I didn't mind. It felt more like an adventure that way. As I hiked further, the trees grew thicker, and the forest grew darker. I had heard stories about the woods being haunted or cursed, but I never put much stock in such things. People like to exaggerate, right? Still, something made me hesitate as I ventured deeper into the forest. The air felt heavier, and the silence between the rustling of the leaves was almost suffocating. I had been hiking for a while, and I wasn't sure how far off the trail I was. That's when I heard it, a faint, distant sound. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was something else. A soft tapping, almost like footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and steady. I froze in place, listening intently. My heart began to race, but I couldn't figure out where the sound was coming from. It wasn't close, but it wasn't too far either. I glanced around, but the trees were so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead of me. The tapping stopped, and in the stillness that followed, my pulse hammered in my ears. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to calm myself down. It had to be an animal, I thought. Maybe a deer or a bear, something that could make odd, irregular sounds. But still, I didn't move. I didn't know what to do. I was just standing in the middle of the forest, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me. Finally, I decided it was best to head back to camp. Whatever that sound was, it didn't feel natural, and I didn't want to stick around to find out more. My legs felt like lead as I made my way back to the trail, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled in my chest. When I got back to the campsite, the sun was nearly gone, and the sky had turned a deep purple. The fire was still going strong, and the warmth felt good against the cool air that was beginning to settle in. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail, and I was starting to think I might have just imagined the whole thing. I ate a simple meal and watched the stars appear overhead, feeling a little silly for being so on edge. After all, it was just a forest, right? I had camped alone plenty of times before. I was an experienced hiker and camper. There was no reason to be scared. But as the night deepened, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The sounds of the forest around me, crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional owl, seemed muffled, like the world was holding its breath. And that's when I heard it again, the tapping. At first, it was faint, far away. But as the minutes passed, it grew louder, closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced around the campsite, but all I could see were the shadows of the trees stretching out in the dim firelight. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it in the direction of the sound, but all I saw was the thick underbrush and the dark trunks of the trees. The tapping continued, now unmistakable. Someone, or something, was walking through the woods, and it was heading straight for me. I stood there frozen, unsure of what to do. My mind raced with possibilities, most of them worse than the last. Was it another camper? A hiker who had gotten lost? Or was it something else? Something that didn't belong out here in the woods? I decided to act. I wasn't going to sit around and wait for whatever it was to find me. I grabbed my backpack, threw on my jacket, and without thinking too much, started moving toward the sound. My feet crunched the leaves beneath me, and my breath came in sharp gasps. I didn't know why I felt the need to investigate. Maybe I thought it was just another hiker who had gotten lost, or maybe I was just too scared to stay in the campsite alone. The tapping grew louder as I moved deeper into the woods, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I shone my flashlight ahead, but the beam of light only cut through the dark for a few feet. The trees stretched out in every direction, their twisted branches reaching for the sky like fingers. There was a palpable sense of unease in the air, like the woods were alive and watching. Then suddenly the tapping stopped. I froze in place, straining to hear anything else, but all I could hear was the wind in the trees. Nothing moved. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, and then, out of nowhere, I heard a low growl. It was distant, but unmistakable. The growl of something large, something powerful. My heart skipped a beat, and I backed away slowly, trying to stay calm. I couldn't tell where the sound was coming from, but I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck bristling. I had heard enough about wild animals to know that it wasn't safe to stick around if there was something large in the area. Bears, mountain lions, they could all be dangerous if you provoked them. I turned to head back to camp, my mind racing, but my legs were moving faster than my thoughts. I had to get back, and then the tapping started again. But this time, it was right behind me. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. There was nothing there, just trees, shadows, and the distant rustling of leaves. But that sound, it was so real, so distinct, I could feel it in my bones. I didn't wait to hear it again. I ran. My legs burned, my heart pounded, and every footstep felt like it could be my last. The flashlight bounced in my hand, barely illuminating the path ahead of me. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees leaning in, as if they were trying to trap me. I burst into the campsite, panting, gasping for breath. The fire was still crackling, the only source of light in the otherwise pitch-black night. My tent was just a few feet away, and I could see it now, my sanctuary. I didn't stop to think. I just dove into the tent, zipped it up as fast as I could, and collapsed onto the ground. I stayed there, breathing heavily, for what felt like hours. The tapping had stopped. The growling had stopped. The forest was silent once again. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened. Had I imagined it all? Was it a wild animal? Or was it something else? But as the fire flickered outside and the stars twinkled above, I felt something change. The air didn't feel as heavy as it did before. The woods didn't feel as oppressive. I lay there in my tent, listening to the sounds of the night, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't alone out here. The forest had let me go, and I was safe. In the end, I made it through the night. In the morning, the sun rose over the trees, and the forest seemed like it had always been peaceful. I packed up my things, and for a moment, I thought about staying longer, finishing the hike I had started the day before. But something inside me told me it was time to leave. I headed back to my car, the trail feeling familiar again, the tension from the night before slowly fading away. Whatever had happened out there, whatever that sound was, I wasn't sure I'd ever know. But one thing was for sure, I wasn't going back to that campsite again. The forest had been quiet the next morning, but I knew better than to tempt it again. I never thought a camping trip would end like this. What started as a chance to get away from the noise of the city quickly turned into a fight for survival. I had everything I thought I needed: a sturdy tent, food, a flashlight, and a knife. But no amount of gear could have prepared me for the events that unfolded. It was just me. I decided to head out solo, looking for some peace, a break from everything. The hike had taken longer than expected. The trail had been steeper, the sun hotter, and my backpack heavier than I'd anticipated. I finally made it to the campsite by late afternoon. It wasn't the ideal spot, a little more exposed than I would have liked, but it would do. There was a small stream nearby for water and a few trees to give some shade. Perfect for a solo trip. I set up my tent, unpacked my gear, and started a small fire. The crackle of the flames was calming, the smoke swirling into the evening air. I roasted some food, letting the smell fill the air. It was strange to be out here by myself, but I felt comfortable. There were no distractions, no loud noises, just the quiet of the woods and the fire. As the light faded, the woods began to feel different. I couldn't quite place it, but something was off. The shadows seemed deeper, the wind more constant. It wasn't anything I could explain. I brushed it off, convinced that it was just the unfamiliarity of being alone in nature. I lay down in my tent, the sounds of crickets and distant rustling filling the air. I was tired, but sleep wouldn't come. I kept thinking I heard something, a twig snapping, a footstep, but every time I listened closely, it stopped. My mind raced, but I eventually drifted off. It was around midnight when I woke up. I had no idea what woke me, but there was a sense of unease in the air. The fire outside had burned down to embers, but I could still see faint glowing light through the thin fabric of my tent. I lay still, listening. That's when I heard it again. A sound. It was hard to describe. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a bird or animal. It was just a sound, almost like breathing. Slow, steady, just outside my tent. I sat up quickly, my heart racing. I wasn't sure what to do. It wasn't the sound of someone walking. It was something else, something almost deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight, turning it on. The beam flickered at first, but then it was bright enough to light up the inside of my tent. I could see everything clearly, but there was nothing there. No person, no animal. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. It felt like something was just outside, waiting. For a long time, I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I told myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I was being paranoid. But I couldn't shake the feeling. Something was wrong. I had to check it out. I grabbed my knife and unzipped the tent slowly, careful not to make too much noise. The world outside was pitch black, save for the faint glow of the embers. The air was cold now, but my skin felt hot with fear. I stepped out, the ground soft beneath my boots. I looked around, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. There was no sign of anything unusual. But then I heard it again, a rustling. No animal, no wind, just the unmistakable sound of something moving in the distance. I froze, scanning the trees. My hand gripped the flashlight so tight that my knuckles turned white. Then I saw it, just for a moment, a shadow moving between the trees. It was tall, too tall to be any animal and too fast to be a person. My stomach dropped. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I needed to leave. I didn't want to stay another minute, but I didn't know which direction was safe. My mind raced. Should I go back to the trailhead? Try to find another campsite? Or just pack up and leave entirely? I turned around to go back to the tent, but when I looked at the fire, my heart stopped. The embers weren't glowing anymore. The fire was completely out, and the air was colder. The temperature had dropped drastically in the last few minutes. I could see my breath now, the faint mist in the beam of my flashlight. That's when I heard the footsteps. Heavy, slow. It was moving toward me. Panic surged through my chest. I grabbed my backpack, my gear, throwing it all into the tent. I wasn't thinking straight. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I needed to get out. My body felt numb from the cold, but I didn't stop. I zipped up the tent, grabbed my knife, and headed for the tree line. My only goal was to get away from the campsite, away from whatever was out there. The sounds of footsteps followed me, but I never looked back. My flashlight was useless now, only making things worse. The trees were too close, too thick. The shadows twisted, and every crack of a branch felt like someone was right behind me. I ran, my breath sharp, my legs burning, but I couldn't stop. I had no plan. I had no idea where I was going. All I knew was that I had to keep moving. Eventually, I stumbled upon a small clearing. I stopped to catch my breath, praying I had lost whatever was following me. That's when I heard the last sound I ever wanted to hear, the snap of a twig behind me. I spun around, knife in hand, ready to defend myself. My heart was pounding in my ears, my breath ragged, but there was nothing there.
No shadow.
No figure, nothing but the wind. But the feeling of being watched never left. It was as if whatever had been following me had just stopped, waiting, watching. I didn't stop running until I reached the trailhead. I never looked back. As I walked toward my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Something was with me. Maybe it had always been there, lurking in the shadows, just waiting for me to realize it. I made it to my car. I didn't waste a second. I threw open the door, jumped in, and started the engine, my hands shaking. It wasn't until I was halfway home that I dared to look in my rearview mirror. There was nothing. No shadow, no figure. Just the empty road behind me. When I got home, I checked my backpack, my tent, everything I had brought with me. I found nothing unusual. No signs of anything that would explain what happened. But that night, I couldn't sleep. The memories of the forest, the feeling of being hunted, stayed with me. They still do. I'll never go camping alone again. I never imagined that a camping trip, something as simple as sleeping under the stars, could turn into a nightmare. It was supposed to be just a weekend getaway, something to disconnect from the noise of everyday life, but that night would change everything. It started off harmless enough. My friends and I, all of us avid hikers, had been planning this camping trip for weeks. We were supposed to hike through a less traveled part of the forest, set up camp by a secluded lake, and just relax for a couple of days. It was late autumn, the kind of chill in the air that made your breath visible, but not cold enough to freeze your toes. The kind of weather that felt fresh, crisp, perfect for a campfire. We parked our cars at the trailhead early in the morning, our backpacks loaded with everything we'd need for 2 days in the woods. We'd chosen a secluded area on purpose. No one around for miles, no cell service, just trees and the silence of nature. Felt freeing. The hike was long, about 6 miles to the lake, and by the time we arrived, the sun was already dipping low. We found a spot just by the water, hidden by tall pines that provided perfect cover for our tents. We set up camp quickly, the fire pit crackling with the first few logs, the sound of the flames popping in the still evening air. I remember feeling content, maybe even too relaxed. It was so quiet. It was the kind of silence that, after a while, starts to feel unnatural. But we were all used to the woods. We joked around as we unpacked, setting up the small stove to cook dinner as the firelight cast long shadows around the camp. That first night passed uneventfully. We ate, talked, and watched the fire flicker as the stars slowly filled the sky above us. We were tired from the hike, so after a while, we crawled into our tents, zipped them up against the cold, and tried to get some sleep. But I couldn't sleep. I don't know if it was the unfamiliar sounds of the forest at night or the eerie stillness, but I just couldn't get comfortable. I tossed and turned in my sleeping bag, listening to the faint rustle of leaves outside my tent. Every so often, I thought I heard something else. Footsteps maybe, or the snap of a twig. At first, I convinced myself it was just the wind. But then I heard something again, louder this time. It wasn't the wind. I lay still, holding my breath, straining to hear. There it was again, definite footsteps. But they didn't sound like animal tracks. No, these were too deliberate, too heavy. They seemed to come from the woods around us. I felt my pulse quicken. I wasn't alone out here. I didn't dare to move or even make a sound. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a person, another hiker. Maybe it was a ranger coming to check if we were allowed to camp here. But something about it didn't sit right. The footsteps stopped, and for a long while, all I could hear was the soft crackle of the fire. Then I heard something else, a low whistle. Short, sharp, and haunting in the still air. I froze, my heart thumping in my chest. Who could possibly be out there whistling like that? It wasn't a bird. It was too human. The whistle came again, softer this time, but it sounded like it was just on the other side of the tent. I wanted to call out to my friends, but I was too scared. I had this terrible feeling that if I made any noise, it would hear me. So I kept quiet, barely breathing, listening as the footsteps grew closer. I heard the crunch of dry leaves, then the sound of something moving through the underbrush, something heavy. I barely dared to move, but my eyes locked onto the small gap in the tent, where I could barely see the flickering light of the fire. I thought I saw a shadow moving past it, just for a moment. Suddenly, I heard a low voice. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't a whisper either. It was almost a grunt, a huff, as though someone was frustrated, or was it laughing? I could feel the blood drain from my face. My palms started to sweat. Whoever it was didn't sound like they were walking away. They were coming closer. I wanted to scream. I wanted to wake up my friends, but I didn't dare. I kept listening, my ears straining to hear over the sound of my own rapid breathing. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went quiet. I lay there wide-eyed, listening to the silence again, but this time it felt different. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind of silence that comes before something happens. I must have fallen asleep eventually, though I couldn't remember exactly when. My dreams were restless, filled with shadows and distant whispers. When I woke up the next morning, everything seemed normal again. The sun was up, the birds were chirping, and my friends were already stirring, preparing breakfast by the fire. But there was something that felt off. My stomach was in knots, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was probably just a deer or some other animal. But I couldn't deny the unease that lingered in my gut. We spent the rest of the day hiking around the lake, taking in the scenery, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that we were being watched. Every time I turned my head, I felt like there was someone or something out of sight, just beyond the trees. My friends joked around, oblivious to my discomfort, and I tried to enjoy myself, but the tension never really left. That night, when the sun set and the air grew colder, we sat around the fire again, the shadows stretching long across the ground. I kept an eye on the woods, but I didn't hear anything unusual. No footsteps, no whistles. The silence was almost too much. But then, just as we were finishing our dinner, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was a low hum, a sound like someone was singing, but it was distant, muffled. Came from deep within the woods. I looked at my friends, but they hadn't heard it. I was sure of it. I tried to ignore it, but the sound was persistent, growing louder, like a soft chant. Felt wrong, unsettling. I stood up abruptly, startling everyone. "I think we should go," I said, my voice tight. "What?" one of my friends asked, looking up at me. "Go where?" "Back to the cars," I said quickly. "We need to leave. Something's not right." They laughed it off, thinking I was just being paranoid. But the humming continued, louder now, as if it was drawing closer. I could feel my heart racing, and the panic started to creep in. I grabbed my backpack and started to move toward the trail. "Wait, are you serious?" my friend said. "It's just a stupid song or something. Chill out." I didn't care. I wasn't staying. The humming was unbearable now. I heard a twig snap, followed by a low whistle again. This time, it was so close, I knew it was coming from the trees just behind us. My friends must have seen the terror in my face because they finally stood up, packing their things, albeit reluctantly. We grabbed our stuff and moved as quickly as we could back to the trail. But the moment we stepped into the forest, everything changed. It was like the woods had swallowed us whole. The path that had been so clear earlier now seemed like a maze. The trees seemed to close in on us, their branches twisting like hands reaching out to grab us. Every step felt wrong, as though we were being led deeper into the forest rather than away from it. And then, in the distance, we saw something, an odd light flickering between the trees. It wasn't the firelight from our camp. It was too steady, too bright. It seemed to be moving toward us. We stopped dead in our tracks, staring at the light, unable to move. It stopped. A silence fell again. But this time, it wasn't the peaceful quiet of before. This silence felt pregnant, waiting for something to happen. I turned to my friends. "What do we do?" I whispered. Before anyone could answer, a voice, deep and raspy, cut through the silence. "Get out!" The light flared once, then vanished, leaving us in the dark. Without a word, we turned and ran. We didn't stop to look back. The trail had changed, the woods had changed, and all I wanted was to get out. I led the way, my heart pounding in my chest. We didn't stop until we reached the cars, the parking lot still dim under the moonlight. We piled into the vehicles, slammed the doors, and didn't say a word as we drove away. Looking back, it wasn't the strange noises or the eerie silence that haunted me the most. It was the feeling that whatever was out there in the woods was watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. I've never gone camping again. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway, a simple camping trip, just me, my tent, and the wilderness. I had planned it all out for weeks, getting the gear together, packing enough food, checking the weather forecasts, and marking the perfect location on the map. A secluded spot by the lake, a place no one else would bother me, far enough from the noise of the city. I arrived at the campsite in the afternoon, the air still warm but with the subtle chill that hints at evening coming soon. The hike from the parking lot to the site wasn't difficult, just a couple of miles along a narrow trail that wound its way through dense trees. The kind of peaceful quiet you can only find in a place where human voices are few and far between. Birds were chirping, the wind rustling through the leaves. It was the kind of day that made you forget about everything back home. The campsite was just as I remembered it from the maps, right by the edge of the lake with a small clearing perfect for setting up the tent. The lake itself was calm, reflecting the blue sky above, and the tall trees surrounding the area gave it a feeling of being tucked away from the world. Felt like my own little slice of nature. Setting up the tent was easy enough. I laid out my sleeping bag, organized my supplies, and made sure everything was in order. I was eager to get a fire going, though. As night would soon fall, I knew the warmth from the flames would be comforting. But before that, I decided to take a short walk around the area, stretching my legs after the hike. The trail led me deeper into the woods, the trees growing denser with every step. It felt a bit more isolated now, the sunlight barely reaching the forest floor. The deeper I went, the quieter it became, almost too quiet. It wasn't the usual peaceful quiet you find in the wilderness, but something heavier. Felt like the forest was holding its breath. I pushed the feeling aside and continued on, telling myself it was just my imagination. But something about the silence kept gnawing at me. No animals, no birds, nothing. Just the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot. The deeper I walked, the more the unsettling feeling grew. Something was off, and then I noticed it. A sound, very faint at first, like a distant whisper, but I couldn't quite place it. I stopped walking, straining to hear. There it was again, a soft noise, like someone moving in the woods. Not an animal, not the wind, but something else. I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned back toward the camp, my steps quickening. The last thing I wanted was to get lost out here, especially with that strange noise echoing in my ears. As I made my way back to the clearing, the unease I had felt earlier didn't disappear. It stayed with me, nagging at the back of my mind. By the time I returned to the camp, the sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. I built the fire quickly, trying to focus on the task at hand. The crackling of the flames was reassuring, a small comfort against the strange feeling that lingered in the air. I roasted some marshmallows, ate a bit of the food I'd brought, and tried to relax. But I couldn't shake the thought that I wasn't alone. I told myself it was nothing. There were always sounds in the woods, things I couldn't explain. I didn't want to overthink it, but as darkness fully settled in, the feeling only grew stronger. It wasn't long before I decided to call it a night. I zipped up my tent and settled into my sleeping bag, trying to ignore the constant prickle of unease. That's when it happened. The sound. The same faint rustle I had heard earlier, but closer now. It was coming from outside the tent, just on the other side of the thin fabric. I froze, holding my breath. Was it an animal? Maybe a deer? Or a raccoon? But it didn't sound like that. The movement was too deliberate, too careful, like something or someone was trying to stay hidden. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just imagining things. But the sound continued, just out of reach. I could hear the subtle creak of branches, the soft crunch of footsteps on the ground. Whoever or whatever was out there, it wasn't making any effort to hide its presence anymore. My heart pounded in my chest, and I told myself to stay calm. I had a knife in my bag, and I could easily defend myself if needed. But the more I listened, the more I realized just how wrong everything felt. The sound wasn't normal. It was too purposeful, too knowing. Then, something shifted in the trees behind my tent. A sudden crash. Something large, moving quickly, like it had been waiting to make its move. I couldn't see anything through the thin fabric of the tent, but I felt it, the presence outside, hovering just beyond my vision. I grabbed my flashlight, my hand shaking as I clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the dark, illuminating the surrounding trees. But there was nothing, just the rustling leaves and the quiet hum of insects. I breathed a little easier, though the unease still lingered. I didn't dare go out there to investigate. I stayed inside my tent, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline, waiting for whatever was out there to make its next move. The night dragged on and I couldn't sleep. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my heart race. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how exposed I was out here. There were no other campers, no one to help me if something went wrong. The night passed slowly, but eventually morning came. The forest was still, the sunlight spilling through the trees in soft beams. I didn't waste any time. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, trying not to look over my shoulder. When I finally made it back to the parking lot, I didn't stop until I was in my car, windows rolled up, doors locked. I drove away as fast as I could, not once looking back at the woods. It was supposed to be just a regular weekend camping trip, something to disconnect from the noise of the world, a chance to enjoy some peace and solitude in the woods. I didn't think it would end up being anything more than a relaxing few days with nothing but the crackle of the fire and the rustling of the leaves to keep me company. I packed the usual stuff: a tent, sleeping bag, a few cans of soup, some granola bars, and my water bottle. Nothing fancy, just the essentials. It was just me this time. The others had backed out at the last minute for various reasons, work, family stuff, whatever. So I decided to go alone. I had camped in this spot before. It wasn't far from the trailhead, but it was secluded enough to feel like I was deep in nature. The trees were dense around the campsite, blocking out most of the light from the outside world. Perfect for what I wanted. Quiet, calm, and away from everything. The drive to the camping site was uneventful. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon as I arrived, painting the sky a warm orange. I parked at the edge of the woods and started unloading my gear. The air was crisp, the kind of cold you get when the sun is almost gone but hasn't left yet. I could hear the wind stirring the branches of the trees and the distant call of birds heading home for the night. I set up camp quickly. The tent was small, just big enough for me to lie down comfortably and keep my stuff inside. I started a fire as the shadows deepened around me. There's something oddly comforting about being alone in the woods at night, surrounded by the crackle of a fire and the whisper of the wind. Felt safe, like I was the only one in the world. But even as the fire warmed my face, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I told myself it was nothing, just the kind of nerves you get when you're alone in a place like this. So, I sat there, roasting a marshmallow, watching the fire flicker as the night fell deeper. The first sign something was wrong came when I noticed a shadow just outside the circle of firelight. I blinked, thinking it was just the fire playing tricks on my eyes. But when I looked again, it was still there, just out of the reach of the flames, where the trees grew thick. It was a shape. At first, I thought it might be an animal, a deer, maybe, or a raccoon, but then I realized it was too tall for that. Stood still, not moving. My heart skipped a beat. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, that it wasn't anything to worry about. But the longer I stared, the more uncomfortable I felt. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on, scanning the edge of the campsite. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but when it passed over the trees, there was nothing. No shape, no movement, just the stillness of the woods. I sighed and shook my head, blaming it on my mind playing tricks on me. It had been a long drive, and I hadn't eaten much today. Maybe I was just tired. I turned off the flashlight and went back to my fire, trying to calm my racing thoughts. But I couldn't get rid of the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, watching me. The night grew colder, and I wrapped my jacket tighter around myself, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. The fire crackled as the flames started to die down, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch farther into the woods. I had just thrown another log onto the fire when I heard it. A twig snapped. It wasn't close, but it was close enough to make my head snap in the direction of the sound. I froze, listening. The woods had gone silent again, except for the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. My pulse quickened. It was probably just an animal, I told myself. A squirrel or a rabbit, something small. But then came another sound. This one was heavier. A thud, like someone stepping on the ground a little too hard. I stood up, heart pounding. I wasn't sure what to do. The logical part of my brain told me to stay calm. I was alone, and there wasn't anyone out here besides me. But another part of me was starting to panic. What if someone else had come into the woods? Someone who wasn't supposed to be here? I grabbed the hunting knife from my bag, a little comfort in the cold steel. It wasn't much, but it made me feel safer. I stepped cautiously toward the edge of the campsite, my flashlight in hand, but as I swept the light across the trees, there was nothing. The forest was still, unnervingly so. No animals, no movement. I felt ridiculous, standing there in the dark, holding a flashlight and a knife, my heart racing for no reason at all. I was being paranoid. There was nothing out there, nothing but trees and the sound of the wind. I turned back to the fire and tried to convince myself to relax. But the atmosphere had changed. It wasn't peaceful anymore. The woods felt too quiet, almost unnatural. And as I sat back down, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone who wasn't supposed to be here, was nearby, watching me. I tried to push the thought out of my mind. I was alone in the woods. Nothing strange had happened. Yet, the longer I sat there, the more I couldn't ignore the eerie tension in the air. It was like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me jump. The crackling of the fire seemed too loud, too close. Every time the wind shifted, I'd hear a rustle in the trees. My mind kept racing. I told myself I was being foolish, that I just needed to sleep and everything would be fine. But the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. Morning came, and with it, a fresh layer of frost covering the ground. The sun was up, but the woods still felt heavy. I tried to tell myself that it was all just nerves, that there was nothing to be afraid of. I started packing up my things, eager to leave. The place was beautiful, but something about it was off. Too still, too quiet. As I walked to my car, I noticed something strange. The ground around my campsite wasn't just disturbed. It was trampled. There were heavy boot prints in the dirt, as if someone had been walking around my tent during the night. But I hadn't heard anyone. No footsteps, no sounds of movement, just silence. I stared at the prints for a long time, feeling my stomach twist. Someone had been out there. Someone had been close enough to my campsite that I hadn't noticed. Maybe it was a hiker, but I didn't remember seeing anyone on the trail when I arrived. I hurried back to my car, my hands shaking as I loaded the last of my gear into the trunk. My mind raced with thoughts of who or what had been lurking out there. I kept expecting to see someone appear from behind a tree, but there was nothing, just the emptiness of the woods, stretching out forever. When I finally drove away, I didn't look back. I had always been a fan of the outdoors. The idea of being far from the noise of the city, surrounded by nothing but trees, the sound of rustling leaves, and the crackling of a campfire was something I treasured. So, when the opportunity came to spend a weekend camping in the forest with just myself and my gear, I jumped at it. The forest I chose was about a 2-hour drive from my house, located deep in a secluded national park. The park was known for its rugged trails, hidden lakes, and the occasional sightings of wildlife. It was late fall, so the days were getting shorter, and the air had a crisp bite to it, signaling the fast approaching winter. Perfect, I thought. A weekend to myself to disconnect and find some peace. I packed light but smart tent, sleeping bag, a stove, some dehydrated meals, a hatchet, first aid kit, a map, and my trusty flashlight. I didn't need much else. The idea was to stay off the beaten path so I'd avoid the crowded campsites. I was prepared for solitude, for quiet nights, and for a few peaceful days in nature. I arrived at the trailhead around mid-afternoon. There were a few cars parked near the entrance, but the crowd was thinning. I could already feel the weight of the solitude settling over me. I shouldered my pack, took a deep breath of fresh forest air, and began the hike. The trail was easy at first, a well-worn path that wound through towering pine trees and dense underbrush. There was no one else in sight, which was perfect. I felt my mind start to ease as I got deeper into the woods. The leaves crunched beneath my boots. The air smelled of wet earth and pine needles. It was beautiful, quiet, and strangely comforting. By the time I found a secluded spot near a small creek, the sun was beginning to set. I set up my tent, built a fire ring, and got the campfire going. The crackle of the fire was the only sound, mixing with the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. I sat back, watching the flames dance and trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. It was just the forest. It was just me. As night fell, the temperature dropped rapidly. I wrapped myself in a warm jacket, kept the fire going, and took a sip from my water bottle. It felt good to be so far removed from everything else. I thought about the days ahead. Maybe a hike up a nearby hill to catch the sunrise, or a trip down to the lake to do some fishing. The possibilities felt endless. But then, something changed. The first sound I heard was subtle, barely noticeable, a soft crunch of leaves. I froze, straining my ears to catch the source. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe an animal moving through the underbrush. But then it came again, closer this time and more deliberate. It was the sound of something walking in the woods. I glanced around, scanning the tree line. There was nothing. No shape, no movement, just the flickering firelight casting long, distorted shadows on the ground. I told myself it was nothing. It had to be the wind or maybe a deer. But the sound persisted. Slowly, methodically, it came closer. I stood up, my heart beating faster than it should. The fire crackled loudly, and I fed it a few more logs to make the flames brighter. The shadows stretched across the ground, and I could no longer ignore the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. I reached for my flashlight, holding it tightly. My mind was racing now, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone else was hiking nearby, or perhaps it was just a small animal like a raccoon, curious about the fire. But the sounds had a deliberate rhythm, too heavy for an animal. The footsteps seemed human, and they were getting closer. I turned off the flashlight and crouched low behind a fallen log, trying to listen more intently. The sounds stopped. Complete silence. I waited for what felt like an eternity. My pulse was pounding in my ears, and my mouth was dry. I couldn't see anything in the dark woods beyond the firelight. I couldn't hear anything either. I almost convinced myself it was nothing. It had to be. But just as I was about to stand up, I heard it again, this time from the other side of my camp. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, closer than ever. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just waited, hoping the sound would go away. But it didn't. The footsteps circled my camp, moving silently through the brush. I couldn't see anything in the dark, couldn't make out who or what was out there. I reached for the hatchet at my side, clutching the handle tightly. My instincts told me to run, but I couldn't leave my gear behind. I didn't know who or what was watching me, but I didn't want to find out. And I sure as hell didn't want to be alone in the dark woods with something or someone out there. The footsteps paused. There was complete silence again, and I thought, maybe, just maybe, it had gone away. Then I heard a twig snap, right behind me. I whipped around, my breath caught in my throat, but there was nothing. Nothing but the firelight and shadows, the endless trees around me. My mind was racing, trying to think, trying to plan. There was no way I could sleep now. The night stretched out before me, endless and terrifying. I kept the fire going, my eyes scanning the edges of the light, trying to see any movement. Minutes passed, hours maybe, I don't know. Time slowed down when you're terrified. Every creak of the branches, every rustle of leaves, made me jump. I knew I couldn't stay awake forever, and my mind was slowly starting to unravel from the stress. Just as I was about to give in, just when the terror was becoming too much to bear, I heard something I wasn't expecting. A voice. It was soft, just above a whisper, and it came from the woods. Not directly from behind me, but not far either. A voice, a low, calming sound. "Help me." I froze. It was a woman's voice. The tone wasn't urgent, but it wasn't casual either. It was pleading, desperate. I stood up so quickly I nearly knocked over the fire. My flashlight fell to the ground, its beam catching the trees in odd, fractured patterns. The voice repeated, "Help me, please." There was no mistaking it. It was human and it was real. I looked around, heart hammering. I had no idea what to do. It could be a trap, it could be someone playing some sick game, or it could be someone in real danger. I didn't know, but I couldn't leave someone in trouble. I grabbed my flashlight, turned it on, and started walking cautiously toward the source of the voice. Every step felt heavier than the last, my mind racing with every possible outcome, good or bad. I moved through the woods, the beam of the flashlight trembling in my hand. The voice grew fainter as I moved deeper into the forest, but it kept calling. It wasn't far. Then I saw something, a figure crouched down near the base of a tree. I froze again, my breath caught. It was a woman, her face hidden in her hands, sitting in the dirt. She was shivering. I called out softly, "Are you okay?" But she didn't respond. I stepped closer, my instincts telling me something wasn't right. I couldn't quite place it, but something about the whole situation seemed off. Then, without warning, she looked up at me, and my heart nearly stopped. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, but they were glassy, unfocused. Her mouth moved, but there were no words, just that vacant stare, as though she wasn't really there. And then, from somewhere deep in the woods, a voice broke the silence. This time a man's. "Don't go near her." I spun around, the beam of the flashlight bouncing wildly as my mind processed the new sound. The man's voice was stern, commanding. I had no idea who he was, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone out here. Not anymore. Suddenly, it all clicked. I didn't stay to figure out the rest. I turned and ran, not looking back, not stopping until I reached my tent. The rest of the night passed in an exhausting blur of frantic thoughts, the distant echo of voices still lingering in the air. The next morning, I packed up my gear and left without a moment's hesitation. I didn't care to find out who those voices belonged to or what the truth was behind them. All I knew was that I wouldn't be returning to that forest. I don't know who they were or if anyone ever found them, but as I left that place, a sense of relief washed over me. Sometimes there's no need for answers. Sometimes it's better to just leave and let it go. And I never went camping in that forest again. I had never been the type to back down from an adventure, especially when it came to camping. My friends and I had done it countless times, and every time it felt like we were getting a little more skilled at surviving the outdoors, a little braver. This time was supposed to be no different. We were heading into a remote part of the forest, a place far from the usual campsites people used. There were no marked trails, no park rangers patrolling the area. Just us, a small group of friends, a few tents, and the vast expanse of wilderness surrounding us. It was a late afternoon when we arrived, the sunlight still peeking through the trees but starting to dip below the horizon. The weather had been perfect, warm during the day, cool at night. We'd been planning this trip for weeks, picking out our gear, figuring out what food to bring, and making sure we were well prepared. The idea was to disconnect from everything for a few days, leave the hustle and bustle of daily life behind, and just relax. At least that's what I thought it would be. The place we chose was one of those areas that wasn't well known, not crowded with tourists or hikers. You had to drive down a long, unpaved road to get there, and even though the area had no official campground, there was a small clearing where we set up our tents. It was peaceful, isolated, and perfect for what we wanted. Quiet nights by the fire, laughter, and maybe a little bit of fishing if we felt like it. But as the sun set, something didn't feel quite right. I tried to shake it off at first. It was probably just the unfamiliarity of the place. I'd been camping 100 times, but I'd never been this far out before, this far from any kind of civilization. The wind had picked up, rustling the branches overhead, making the trees creak and groan in the darkening twilight. It was nothing unusual, but there was something about the sound that set me on edge. The way the wind moved through the forest felt wrong, like it was being guided by something other than nature. We had built the campfire quickly, and for a while everything felt normal. We sat around it, passing around beers, talking about work, and making fun of each other. Laughter echoed through the trees, a small comfort against the growing feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. There were no other campers around, no animals calling out in the distance. The forest felt strangely silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves or snap of a twig. But those sounds were different, sharper, like something or someone was moving around us in the shadows. I brushed it off as just the paranoia that comes with being out in the woods, far from the comfort of home. But as the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling. It was like we were being watched. The others didn't seem to notice anything unusual. We roasted marshmallows, told stories, and listened to the crackle of the fire. But the whole time, I kept catching glimpses of movement in the tree line, just beyond the circle of light the fire cast. It wasn't animals. Animals don't move like that, slow and deliberate, weaving between the trees with a purpose. I wasn't sure what time it was when it happened. The fire had burned low, and most of my friends had already gone to their tents to sleep. I stayed up a little longer, staring into the dying embers, trying to ignore the knot in my stomach. That's when I saw it again, movement in the trees. I sat up, suddenly wide awake. The movement was closer this time, and it was unmistakable. Someone or something was out there. I could feel my heart begin to race. I wasn't the type to get spooked easily, but this was different. The way the figure moved was deliberate, controlled. It wasn't the normal scurrying of a raccoon or the quiet step of a deer. This felt purposeful. My first instinct was to call out, but I didn't. I couldn't bring myself to. Something told me that if I made a sound, whatever it was would know I was aware of it. It was like a predator, waiting for the right moment to strike. The wind picked up again, swirling around me, and I could hear the faintest sound, footsteps, crunching through the dry leaves on the forest floor. Then, everything went quiet, too quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I decided to go check it out. Stupid, I know, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight, carefully stepped over the logs by the fire, and started moving toward the edge of the clearing. Every step felt heavier than the last, my breath coming out in quiet, nervous bursts. The light from the flashlight flickered as I scanned the trees, but I couldn't see anything. I kept walking, the beam of light bouncing from tree to tree, looking for any sign of movement. But the further I went, the more the feeling of being watched intensified. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I stopped for a moment, trying to calm myself. That's when I heard it. A soft, guttural noise, a grunt, almost like something trying to make a sound but not quite able to, came from behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just trees. The same trees I had been staring at for the past few minutes. I told myself I was being paranoid. That noise had to be an animal, maybe a deer or a wild boar. I had to focus, had to get back to the fire, get back to my friends. But something kept me rooted in place. My mind screamed at me to leave, to run, but my body refused to move. And then, from the darkness beyond the trees, I saw it again. A shadow moving quickly, just on the edge of my vision. A figure. This time I couldn't deny it. Whatever it was out there, moving toward me. My pulse quickened as the figure darted from one tree to another, always staying just out of the light. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the truth. This wasn't some wild animal. It was a person. Someone or something was out there, and it was coming closer. Panic set in. I turned and ran back toward the camp, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't stop to look back, didn't care if whatever was out there followed me. I just ran, straight back to the fire. When I reached the clearing, I nearly stumbled over a log. I was gasping for breath, the cold night air burning in my lungs. I didn't stop. I dove into the tent where my friends were sleeping, waking them up in a panic. They didn't understand. They told me to calm down, that it was probably just an animal or some other camper messing with me. But I knew it wasn't. It was too deliberate, too calculated. We decided to leave immediately. The night felt suffocating, like the darkness was closing in around us. The idea of staying out there any longer was unbearable. We packed up our things quickly, adrenaline pushing us through the motions. As we made our way to the car, I kept my eyes on the trees, half expecting to see a face staring back at me from the shadows. But there was nothing. The woods were silent again, eerily so. We didn't speak much on the drive back, each of us lost in our thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. And even though we were miles away from that forest now, I still can't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Something had been out there, and it knew we were coming. I understand you'd like a long, detailed camping story. While I can't generate a 7,000-word story in one go, I can still write you a very long and immersive story that will capture the tension and realism you're after. Here's the beginning of your requested camping story. I had always been the outdoors type, the kind of person who felt most at peace when surrounded by trees, the sound of wind rustling through the leaves, and the crisp air of the wilderness. I grew up in a small town where camping trips were a regular weekend event. So when I decided to go on a solo camping trip deep into the forest for a few days, I felt prepared for anything. Little did I know, this trip would change everything. I had chosen a remote part of the forest, far from the usual campgrounds where families set up tents and light campfires. The area I had selected wasn't marked on most maps, and that's exactly what drew me to it. I had researched it online, finding some vague references to it as untouched wilderness, and the idea of being alone in a place like that felt freeing. It was a quiet, forgotten part of the world, and I was eager to experience it. I packed my gear carefully: tent, sleeping bag, water filter, food for several days, and my trusty backpack full of survival tools. I also brought a book to read and a journal to write in, thinking it would be nice to unwind and have some time to reflect. I told myself I would make the most of this trip to disconnect from the noise of daily life. When I arrived, I felt a strange mix of excitement and unease, but I pushed the feeling aside. I had spent a few hours hiking to get there, and I was glad to finally reach my destination. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting an orange glow across the dense trees. The air smelled earthy, fresh, exactly as I had imagined. I set up my tent quickly, thankful for the silence that surrounded me, broken only by the distant chirps of birds and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. As night settled in, I started a small campfire and cooked a simple meal. Nothing fancy, just some trail mix and canned soup. The fire crackled and popped, and the warmth from the flames felt comforting. I sat by the fire, enjoying the solitude. I had always found peace in nature, and this was no different. I was alone, but I didn't feel lonely. After dinner, I sat back and watched the stars. The night sky was clear, and the stars seemed to stretch on forever. I pulled out my journal and wrote down some thoughts. How beautiful the night was, how quiet and still everything felt. But as I wrote, I couldn't shake the sense of unease that had started to creep up on me. It was subtle, but there was something about the forest that felt off, like I wasn't quite as alone as I thought. I brushed it off as paranoia. It was probably just the isolation getting to me, I thought. So I finished my journal entry, poked the fire, and laid down in my tent. The sound of the wind outside was comforting, almost like a lullaby. I closed my eyes and drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds singing and the sun already climbing in the sky. It was a cool morning, and I felt refreshed after a good night's sleep. I made breakfast, packed up my camp, and decided to take a hike deeper into the forest. The trails in this part of the forest weren't marked, but I didn't mind. I had a good sense of direction and figured I would just follow the natural terrain. As I walked through the thick woods, I felt a strange calm wash over me. The further I went, the more isolated it felt. It was peaceful, but it also felt a little too quiet, almost like the forest was holding its breath. There were no animals around, no sounds of squirrels scurrying through the leaves, no birds singing, just silence, except for the sound of my boots crunching on the underbrush. As I walked, I stumbled across something strange. Half hidden under some thick vines was a structure, or at least what was left of one. At first, I thought it was just an old log cabin or some forgotten shelter built by hikers years ago. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't what it seemed. The structure was in ruins. Rotted wood, crumbling stone, and a strange feeling in the air around it. The more I stared at it, the more unsettling it became. It wasn't just an abandoned cabin. It was something older, something out of place in this part of the forest. I looked around, expecting to see other hikers or maybe even signs of recent activity. But there was nothing. No footprints, no signs that anyone had been here in a long time. My gut told me to leave, but I was too curious to turn back now. I pushed through the vines and stepped closer to the ruins. That's when I noticed something odd. On the ground near the structure were several broken objects. Old pottery, what looked like pieces of rotting leather, and, most disturbingly, a rusted metal cage, partially buried in the dirt. My heart started to race. Something wasn't right here. This wasn't just some abandoned cabin. It felt like something had happened here. Something unnatural. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I decided I'd had enough. I turned around to leave, but as I did, I heard a faint sound behind me. It was a rustling, like something or someone was moving in the brush. I froze. For a long moment, I didn't hear anything else. The wind rustled the trees, and the silence returned, but my pulse was racing. I told myself it was just an animal. It had to be, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The forest suddenly felt darker, the trees looming overhead like they were watching me. I quickly retraced my steps, walking faster, trying to shake off the feeling of being followed. The quietness of the forest made every sound feel amplified. My own breathing, the crunch of the leaves under my boots, the soft snap of a branch somewhere in the distance. I tried to ignore the rising panic in my chest, but my instincts were telling me to get out of there. I hadn't seen anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was close by. By the time I reached my camp, the sun was beginning to dip below the trees again. I quickly set up my tent, feeling a sudden urge to lock myself in. The forest, once so peaceful and serene, now felt suffocating. I sat inside, listening to every crack and pop from outside, every gust of wind as it passed through the trees. My mind raced, trying to make sense of everything I had just experienced. As the night grew darker, I started to hear strange noises outside my tent. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard something else, soft footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, just on the edge of hearing, but there was no mistaking them. Someone or something was walking around my camp. My heart pounded in my chest, and I held my breath, listening intently. The footsteps came closer, and I could hear them circling my tent. I couldn't move, couldn't even think clearly. I was trapped, alone in the middle of nowhere, and I didn't know who or what was outside. The silence that followed was deafening. My mind raced through every possible explanation. Was it a person? An animal? Some wild creature? Couldn't tell. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. The air was thick with tension, and I strained my ears for any sound, but there was nothing. Slowly, I began to convince myself it was just my imagination, the result of too much isolation. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard something. A twig snapping, a rustling in the bushes, the sound of my own breath. I kept thinking I saw shadows move outside the fabric of my tent. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind, just the forest playing tricks on me. When morning finally came, I didn't wait around. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, feeling a deep sense of relief as I left the area behind. The forest, once so inviting, now felt oppressive, like it was holding me in its grip. I didn't look back, but the unease lingered in the pit of my stomach as I hiked back to civilization. When I finally reached the main trail, I was greeted by a group of hikers. They seemed friendly enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching from the shadows. I didn't share what had happened with them. They wouldn't have understood. That trip changed me. I had gone in looking for peace and solitude, but what I found in that forest was something else entirely. Something that I couldn't explain. I don't go back to that part of the forest anymore, and I tell myself that I'll never go on a solo camping trip again. But sometimes, when I'm walking through the woods on a calm day, I catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, just for a moment, and I wonder if I was ever really alone. The fire crackled softly as I stared into the flickering orange flames, my eyes following the dance of embers that floated up into the dark, star-speckled sky. I had always loved camping, the isolation, the quiet, the rawness of being surrounded by nothing but nature. This time, though, I had chosen a spot farther out than I ever had before. A remote section of the national forest, miles from the nearest trailhead, far from the hum of civilization. It was supposed to be peaceful, rejuvenating. It was anything but. It started with the sound, a faint rustling, barely audible over the crackle of the fire and the occasional snap of a twig in the heat. First, I dismissed it. The forest is alive at night. Small creatures scurrying through the underbrush, leaves shifting in the breeze. But this was different. The rustling had a rhythm to it, a deliberate cadence that set my nerves on edge. I sat up straighter in my camp chair, straining to hear over the pounding of my heart. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable. Footsteps. Not the soft patter of an animal, but the deliberate crunch of boots on dry leaves. I felt my chest tighten. Who else would be out here? I grabbed my flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness as I swept it across the trees. "Hello," I called, my voice breaking the stillness. No response, just the echo of my own voice fading into the night. The footsteps had stopped. For a long moment, I sat frozen, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The forest was silent again, save for the whisper of the wind through the pines. Maybe it was just my imagination, I told myself. The mind plays tricks when you're alone in the dark. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I forced myself to settle back into my chair, though my muscles remained tense, my ears straining for any sound. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the cold was beginning to seep through my jacket. Still, I couldn't relax. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of me, and I crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight. My knife and a can of bear spray lay within arm's reach. Sleep came fitfully, in short bursts, each noise jolting me awake. A snapping branch, the rustle of leaves, my own breathing, too loud in the confined space. When morning finally came, the forest felt less menacing. The sunlight filtering through the trees seemed to chase away the shadows, and I convinced myself that I had overreacted. I packed up my gear and decided to hike farther into the forest, hoping to find a new spot that felt less exposed. The trail was barely a trail at all, more of a faint path worn by deer and the occasional adventurous hiker. It wound through dense undergrowth and over rocky terrain, the kind of place where every step had to be deliberate. By midday, I had found a small clearing by a stream and decided to set up camp there. It felt secluded but safe, the burble of the water providing a soothing backdrop to the rustling leaves. The day passed uneventfully. I fished in the stream, catching a small trout for dinner, and spent the afternoon exploring the area. There was no sign of anyone else, no footprints, no trash, nothing to suggest I wasn't alone. By evening, I had almost convinced myself that the footsteps I heard the night before were a figment of my imagination. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows lengthened, the unease crept back in. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, my ears straining for sounds that didn't belong. When darkness fell, I built another fire, larger than the one the night before, its light casting flickering shadows across the trees. That's when I saw it. A flash of movement, just at the edge of the firelight. Too quick to make out any details, but enough to send my heart racing. I grabbed my flashlight again, its beam cutting through the darkness. "Who's there?" I called, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. Nothing, just the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I stayed by the fire all night, my knife clutched in one hand, the flashlight in the other. Sleep was out of the question. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me on edge, my eyes darting toward the shadows. But nothing happened. No footsteps, no voices, just the oppressive silence of the forest at night. When dawn broke, I made the decision to head back. The solitude I had sought now felt suffocating, the beauty of the forest overshadowed by an undercurrent of dread. I packed up my camp quickly, stuffing everything haphazardly into my pack, and set off toward the trailhead. The hike back was grueling. The trail that had seemed faint but manageable on the way and now felt almost non-existent. More than once, I found myself backtracking, convinced I had missed a turn. The forest seemed denser, the trees pressing in on all sides. The sunlight that had felt warm and reassuring the day before now seemed dim, barely filtering through the canopy. And then I saw them, footprints, fresh, unmistakable in the soft dirt of the trail. They weren't mine. My boots left a distinct tread, and these were larger, deeper. Someone else had been here, recently. My pulse quickened as I scanned the forest, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing, just the endless trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. I considered calling out, but decided against it. Whoever had left those footprints was either ahead of me or behind me, and I wasn't sure which was worse. I picked up my pace, the weight of my pack pressing heavily on my shoulders. The trail became steeper, the terrain more challenging, but I didn't stop. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of the forest as quickly as possible. As the hours dragged on, my exhaustion grew. My legs ached, my throat was dry, and my nerves were frayed. But the thought of stopping, of lingering in the forest for even a moment longer, was unbearable. Finally, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, I reached the trailhead. My car was still there, parked exactly where I had left it. Relief washed over me as I unlocked the door and climbed inside, slamming the locks shut behind me. As I drove away, the tension began to ease, though the unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been followed, watched. But when I glanced in the rearview mirror, the road behind me was empty. It wasn't until I was home, unpacking my gear, that I noticed it. My knife, the one I had kept by my side all night, was missing. I was sure I had packed it, positive, but it wasn't there. Instead, at the bottom of my pack, I found something that didn't belong. A single, weathered bootlace tied in a neat bow. The sun was starting to dip behind the horizon when I reached the trailhead. I'd driven out here alone, hoping for a quiet weekend in the woods. It had been months since I'd taken any time off work, and the stress was starting to pile up. A couple of nights under the stars seemed like the perfect way to reset. The forest was dense, the kind of place where the trees seemed to close in around you as you walked. The trail was narrow but well-marked, winding through thick undergrowth and towering pines. I had my pack strapped tight, my tent, sleeping bag, and enough food for 2 days. I'd chosen a campsite about 4 miles in, a secluded spot by a small, clear lake. As I walked, the light faded quickly. The forest became a maze of shadows, the trees casting long, dark fingers across the trail. I'd started later than I'd planned and hadn't expected the hike to take this long. By the time I reached the lake, the last light of the day had disappeared, leaving only the faint glow of my headlamp to guide me. The campsite was exactly as I'd hoped. Quiet, isolated, with a perfect view of the lake. The water was still, reflecting the stars like a sheet of glass. I set up my tent quickly, the sounds of the forest growing louder in the darkness. Crickets chirped, frogs croaked, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called out. It was peaceful, but there was an edge to it, a sense of being watched that I couldn't shake. I told myself it was just the solitude. I wasn't used to being alone in the woods. After setting up camp, I built a small fire and cooked a simple meal. The warmth of the flames was comforting. The crackling would breaking the stillness of the night. I sat by the fire for a while, sipping a cup of instant coffee and staring into the flames. The forest seemed to close in around me, the darkness pressing against the edges of the firelight. It was late when I finally crawled into my tent. The air was cool, and the sleeping bag felt warm and comforting. I'd been looking forward to this, a good night's sleep under the stars. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling of the tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The usual night sounds seemed muted, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or snap of a twig. I told myself it was just the wind or some small animal moving through the underbrush. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke up to a sound that sent a chill down my spine. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the undergrowth. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen. The steps were uneven, like someone was trying to move quietly but wasn't quite succeeding. They were close, too close for comfort. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the sound of heavy breathing reached my ears. It was coming from just outside the tent. I'd never felt fear like that before. A cold, paralyzing terror that made it impossible to move. Slowly, I reached for the knife I'd left in my pack. My fingers closed around the handle, and I held it tight, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it an animal? Person? I didn't want to find out. The breathing continued, slow and steady, like whoever or whatever was out there was trying to figure out what was inside the tent. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Finally, the breathing stopped, and I heard the sound of footsteps retreating into the woods. I lay there, knife in hand, for what felt like an eternity, listening to the silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I emerged from the tent, my heart still pounding. There were no signs of anything unusual, no tracks, no broken branches, nothing to suggest someone had been there. But I knew what I'd heard. I decided to pack up and head back to the car. The peaceful weekend I'd envisioned was shattered, replaced by a gnawing unease. As I packed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and every sound, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig, set my nerves on edge. The hike back was worse than the night. The trail felt different, more closed in, like the trees were leaning closer, watching me. I tried to move quickly, but the weight of my pack and the uneven terrain slowed me down. Every so often, I'd stop and listen, convinced I'd heard footsteps behind me. But when I turned around, the trail was empty. About halfway back, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. A piece of cloth, torn and dirty, hanging from a branch. It wasn't mine, and it hadn't been there on the way in. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. I left it where it was and kept moving, my pace quickening despite the weight of my pack. The closer I got to the trailhead, the more the feeling of being followed intensified. It wasn't just paranoia, I was sure of it. I could hear it now, faint but distinct. The sound of footsteps, mirroring my own. They'd stop when I stopped, start again when I moved. I didn't run. Running would have made it worse, would have confirmed to whatever was out there that I was scared. Instead, I forced myself to keep walking, one step at a time, until finally, I saw the parking lot through the trees. Relief washed over me as I approached my car, the sight of it like a beacon of safety. I threw my pack in the back and climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind me. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees. But there was nothing, just the empty trailhead and the dense forest beyond. The drive home was quiet, the events of the night replaying in my mind. I'd gone out there looking for peace and solitude, but I'd found something else entirely. Something I couldn't explain, something that had shaken me to my core. I don't know what was out there that night, but I do know one thing: I won't be going back. Even now, weeks later, I can't stop thinking about it. The footsteps, the breathing, the piece of cloth on the trail. It's all burned into my memory, a constant reminder of how vulnerable we are out there in the wild. Sometimes, I tell myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know better. Something was out there, and whatever it was, it wanted me to know it. It started as a trip to escape the noise of the city. My plan was simple: spend a few nights camping in the wilderness, away from work stress and constant notifications. I had picked a spot deep in the woods, about 3 hours drive from home. It was a remote area, not a marked campsite, but somewhere I had found on a hiking forum, a secluded clearing near a small lake. I wanted peace, and I figured this would be the place to find it. I left early in the morning to give myself enough time to set up camp before nightfall. The drive was uneventful, and the further I got from the city, the better I felt. The roads became narrower, the air fresher, and the dense forest on either side of the road gave me a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in months. By the time I parked my car on the shoulder of a gravel road and started unloading my gear, I was excited for the adventure ahead. The hike to the clearing was supposed to take about 2 hours. I had my backpack, a tent, some basic cooking supplies, plenty of water, and a small first aid kit. The trail was faint but visible, and I followed it, occasionally checking the GPS coordinates I had saved on my phone. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. It was quiet in a way that made me feel small but not unwelcome. When I reached the clearing, it was just as described: a grassy patch surrounded by tall trees with a clear view of the sky. The lake was about 50 yards away, its surface glinting under the afternoon sun. I set up my tent in the flattest spot I could find, arranged some rocks for a fire pit, and gathered enough wood to last the evening. By the time I was done, the sun was dipping low, and the temperature was beginning to drop. I made a simple dinner over the fire, a can of chili and some bread. As I ate, I watched the stars slowly appear in the sky. There was no light pollution out here, and the stars seemed impossibly bright. It was exactly what I had hoped for: pure solitude. By the time I crawled into my sleeping bag, the fire was dying, and the forest was dark and silent except for the occasional hoot of an owl. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night to a sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling through the trees, but as I lay still and listened, I realized it was something else. It was a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart started racing. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. Still, I grabbed the flashlight from beside my sleeping bag and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The fire was completely out, and the clearing was pitch black. I scanned the area with the flashlight, but the beam only reached so far before being swallowed by the trees. I didn't see anything unusual, but the sound had stopped as soon as I unzipped the tent. I waited, holding my breath, but there was only silence. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was nothing and zipped the tent back up. It took me a long time to fall asleep again. The next morning, everything seemed normal. The sun was shining, the lake was calm, and the forest was alive with its usual sounds. I shook off the unease from the night before and decided to spend the day exploring the area. I followed the edge of the lake, keeping an eye out for interesting wildlife or good spots for fishing, though I hadn't brought any gear. The forest felt different in the daylight, less mysterious, more inviting. Around midday, I found a small stream feeding into the lake and decided to sit there for a while. I ate a granola bar and let the sound of the running water relax me. But then I noticed something strange. On the opposite bank of the stream, there was a tree with deep scratches on its trunk. They were too high up to be from a small animal and too irregular to be from a tool. I'd heard of bears marking trees like that, but it didn't quite look right. The marks were fresh, the edges of the wood still raw. I made a mental note to be cautious and headed back to camp. That night, I built a bigger fire, hoping it would keep any curious animals away. I cooked another simple meal and spent some time staring at the flames, lost in thought. When it got too cold to sit outside, I retreated to my tent and read a book by the light of my flashlight until my eyes grew heavy. Once again, I woke up in the middle of the night. This time, the sound was closer, distinct footsteps circling the tent. My blood ran cold. I stayed absolutely still, barely breathing, as the footsteps paused, then started again. It wasn't just one set. There were at least two, maybe more. They were slow and deliberate, crunching softly against the ground. I clenched the flashlight in my hand but didn't turn it on. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. I lay there for hours, too terrified to move. When the first light of dawn finally broke, I unzipped the tent and stepped out, heart pounding. The clearing looked undisturbed, but when I walked to the edge of the trees, I found footprints in the dirt. They weren't animal tracks. They were human, barefoot, and there were dozens of them, crisscrossing around the tent and leading off into the woods that I decided then and there to cut the trip short. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The forest felt oppressive now, the trees too close, the shadows too deep. I felt like I was being watched. By the time I started the hike back to my car, my hands were trembling. The trail seemed longer on the way back. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me, but the trail remained empty. When I finally reached the gravel road where I had parked, relief washed over me. The car was right where I had left it, untouched. I threw my gear into the back seat and climbed in, locking the doors behind me. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me a few tries to get the key into the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I felt a wave of relief so strong I almost cried. I drove away without looking back. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something terrible. I replayed the events in my mind over and over, trying to make sense of them. Who had been out there in the middle of the night, barefoot in the forest? And why? I'll never know the answers, but I've made a promise to myself. No more camping alone. The wilderness is beautiful, but it's also unpredictable. It has its own rules, and sometimes it reminds you how small and vulnerable you really are. The air felt heavier as I trudged through the dense woods, my backpack pressing into my shoulders with every step. I had planned this camping trip for months, excited to escape the monotony of my day-to-day life. It was supposed to be a weekend of solitude, of disconnecting from everything and reconnecting with nature. I picked a spot far off the beaten path, one I'd read about in a forum for experienced hikers. Remote, serene, untouched. Sounded perfect. The trail leading up to the campsite wasn't well marked, which was expected. That was part of the appeal. No families with screaming kids. No groups of drunk college students blaring music. Just me and the forest. The undergrowth grew thicker as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows through the trees. I checked my map and compass frequently, making sure I stayed on course. It wasn't my first solo camping trip, but I'd never gone this deep into the wilderness before. By the time I reached the spot I'd marked, the sun was almost gone. The sky streaked with hues of orange and purple. I set my pack down and surveyed the area. It was a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. The ground was soft but not marshy, and there was a decent-sized rock nearby that could serve as a makeshift seat. Perfect. I set up my tent quickly, my movements practiced and efficient. The first rule of camping: always have your shelter ready before dark. Once the tent was up and my sleeping bag unrolled inside, I set about gathering firewood. The woods were silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird settling in for the night. I kept my headlamp on low, not wanting to disturb the peace with too much artificial light. By the time I had a small fire crackling, the sky was pitch black, stars glittering above like shards of broken glass. I sat back and took a deep breath, letting the tension of the week melt away. Dinner was simple. A freeze-dried meal I rehydrated with boiling water. Not gourmet, but it filled my stomach and warmed me from the inside. I sipped on a flask of coffee I'd brought along, the bitter taste grounding me. As the fire burned lower, I stretched out on a foam pad I'd placed near the flames and stared up at the sky. The Milky Way was visible, a hazy streak cutting across the dark expanse. It was moments like this that made the effort worth it. The quiet, the stillness, the feeling of being utterly alone but not lonely. The first sign that something was off came just as I was about to crawl into my tent. I heard a sound, faint but distinct, a crunch like someone stepping on dry leaves. I froze, my hand hovering over the zipper of the tent flap. My headlamp was off, so I stood there in the dark, straining my ears. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't a consistent noise, more like an occasional snap or rustle, as if whatever was moving was trying to be stealthy. My first thought was an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. They were common enough in these parts, and the smell of my dinner might have attracted them. But as I stood there, listening, a strange unease settled over me. The noises weren't random. They had a deliberate rhythm to them, stopping and starting in a way that didn't feel natural. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on, sweeping the beam in a slow arc around the campsite. The light caught the glint of something in the distance, two small points reflecting back at me. They were low to the ground, unmoving, watching. My heart hammered in my chest as I tried to make out what it was. The eyes blinked once, then disappeared as whatever it was moved silently into the underbrush. I told myself it was a fox or a coyote, nothing to worry about. Still, I felt a lingering unease as I zipped myself into the tent. I kept my multi-tool within reach and my flashlight hanging from the roof loop. It took a long time for sleep to come, and when it did, it was restless, broken by dreams of shadows moving through the trees. The next morning, I woke early, the pale light of dawn filtering through the tent. The fire had gone out overnight, leaving a circle of cold ash. I stepped outside and stretched, trying to shake off the grogginess. The woods felt different in the daylight, less menacing. The unease of the previous night seemed almost silly in retrospect. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I dismissed it as leftover paranoia and set about making breakfast. As I boiled water for oatmeal, I noticed something odd. The ground near the edge of the clearing looked disturbed, as if something had been digging. I walked over to inspect it and found a series of shallow scratches in the dirt. They weren't deep, but they formed a pattern, almost like claw marks. I frowned, crouching down to get a better look. They didn't match the paw prints of any animal I was familiar with. Too wide for a coyote, too uneven for a bear. The thought that they might be human didn't cross my mind until much later. The day passed uneventfully. I hiked to a nearby stream, refilled my water bottles, and spent the afternoon exploring the area. The woods were beautiful, the kind of beauty that feels ancient and untouched. But the feeling of being watched never completely left me. I caught myself glancing over my shoulder more than once, my hand instinctively going to the knife on my belt. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was low in the sky. I rebuilt the fire and made dinner, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. As the shadows lengthened, the forest seemed to come alive with sounds. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the occasional distant call of an owl. I kept telling myself it was just the normal sounds of the woods, amplified by my imagination. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night, the noises started again, louder this time and closer. I lay in my tent, every muscle in my body tensed, listening as the sounds circled the campsite. It wasn't an animal. The steps were too deliberate, the pauses too calculated. Whoever or whatever was out there was pacing, moving in a slow, methodical way. My flashlight was in my hand, my grip so tight my knuckles ached. I thought about calling out, but some instinct stopped me. If it was a person, they'd made no effort to announce themselves. That alone was a red flag. The pacing continued for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was deafening. I lay there, holding my breath, waiting for the next sound. But nothing came. Eventually, exhaustion overtook my fear, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. I woke at first light, my heart sinking as I unzipped the tent. The clearing looked the same as it had the day before, but I knew better than to trust appearances. Sure enough, the ground near the edge of the campsite was disturbed again. This time, the scratches were deeper, more deliberate. They formed a crude X as if marking the spot. My stomach churned as I stared at it, my mind racing. This wasn't an animal. Someone had been here watching me, leaving signs. I decided then and there to cut the trip short. I packed up quickly, keeping my knife in hand as I dismantled the tent and doused the fire. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. By the time I hefted my pack onto my shoulders, I was sweating despite the cool morning air. The hike back to the trailhead was grueling. I moved fast, too fast, my boots slipping on loose rocks and uneven ground. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. The woods felt hostile, the towering trees closing in like walls. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound a potential threat. When I finally reached my car, I practically threw my pack into the trunk and climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind me. I sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm my racing heart. The forest loomed around me, silent and watchful. I turned the key in the ignition and didn't look back. It wasn't until I was miles away, the trees giving way to open fields, that I started to feel like I could breathe again. I don't know who or what was out there, but I do know one thing: I won't be going back. The wilderness is beautiful, but it's also vast and unknowable, full of places where no one can hear you scream. It's a place that doesn't care about you, where the line between solitude and danger is razor thin. I'll stick to the marked trails from now on. I woke up to the sound of a twig snapping. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, lying still in my sleeping bag. The air in the tent was cool, almost damp, and it carried the faint scent of pine and earth. My flashlight sat just within reach, but I didn't grab it right away. Instead, I strained my ears, listening. It was one of those nights where everything feels sharper, clearer. The type of night where the silence isn't comforting but oppressive. I could hear the rustle of leaves outside, the occasional creak of trees swaying in the breeze, and now, faint but distinct, the sound of movement. I was camping alone, about 5 miles deep into the woods. It was something I'd done a few times before. I liked the solitude, the chance to disconnect from everything. There was no cell service out here, no distractions. Just me, the woods, and my thoughts. But tonight felt different. The movement outside wasn't the light, aimless scurrying of a small animal. It was deliberate, heavy. Something or someone was out there. I finally grabbed the flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the inside of my tent. Everything was as I'd left it. My backpack in the corner, the half-empty water bottle beside it, my hiking boots neatly placed near the entrance. I unzipped the tent slowly, the sound impossibly loud in the stillness. My hand trembled as I pushed the flap aside and shone the light into the trees. Shadows danced and shifted as the beam moved, but I couldn't see anything unusual, just trees and underbrush. I waited, heart pounding, and then it came again. That crunch of leaves, closer this time. "Hello!" I called out, my voice shaky. It felt stupid as soon as the word left my mouth, but I needed to break the silence. Nothing answered. The woods swallowed the sound, leaving me in a void of stillness. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, flashlight pointed at the trees, ears straining for any noise. Eventually, I convinced myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. I zipped the tent back up and lay down, but I didn't turn off the flashlight. Sleep was impossible. Every noise outside felt amplified, every creak of a branch or rustle of leaves making my pulse race. The next morning, I emerged from the tent to find everything as I'd left it. The fire pit was undisturbed, my supplies untouched. The sun filtered through the canopy, casting dappled light on the ground. In the daylight, it was easier to dismiss the fear of the night before. Animals make noise. That's what they do. I laughed at myself as I boiled water for coffee, the rich, familiar aroma grounding me. I decided to explore a bit after breakfast. There was a trail nearby that led to a small clearing with a view of the valley below. The hike was steep but manageable, and the view at the top was worth every step. The valley stretched out before me, a patchwork of green and brown, with a river cutting through it like a silver thread. I sat there for a while, enjoying the breeze and the warmth of the sun on my face. On the way back to camp, I noticed something odd. A set of footprints in the dirt, too large to be mine, and definitely not made by an animal. They were fresh, the edges of the prints still sharp. My chest tightened as I followed them with my eyes. They led off the trail, disappearing into the underbrush. I stood there for a long moment, debating what to do. Part of me wanted to follow them to see where they led. The other part screamed at me to turn around and head back to camp. In the end, I chose the latter. I told myself it was probably a hiker passing through, someone who'd taken a shortcut off the trail. But the unease from the night before crept back, settling like a weight in my stomach. Back at camp, I decided to pack up and move closer to the main trail. I'd planned to stay another night, but the thought of being so isolated suddenly felt less appealing. As I dismantled the tent, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. I hiked for about an hour before finding a new spot. It wasn't as secluded as the first, but it still felt remote enough. I set up camp quickly, trying to focus on the familiar rhythm of pitching the tent and gathering firewood. By the time I was done, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. That night, the sounds started again. This time, they were closer. The snap of a branch, the crunch of leaves. It wasn't constant, but sporadic, as if whoever or whatever was out there was trying to stay quiet. My flashlight became my lifeline, the beam sweeping back and forth across the trees. But no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't see anything. Sleep was out of the question. I sat up in the tent, clutching a small knife I'd brought with me. The noises continued, sometimes distant, sometimes alarmingly close. At one point, I thought I saw movement in the shadows, but it was gone before I could focus on it. The hours dragged on, each minute stretching into an eternity. When dawn finally broke, I stepped outside the tent, exhausted but relieved. The forest was bathed in golden light, the terror of the night retreating with the darkness. But then I saw it. Near the edge of my campsite, there was a fresh pile of rocks, small but deliberate. It hadn't been there the night before. My blood ran cold. Someone had been here, watching me, close enough to leave this unsettling marker. I packed up as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. I didn't bother eating or boiling water for coffee. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back to the trailhead was a blur. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a branch sent my heart racing. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But the trail remained empty, the forest eerily silent. When I finally reached my car, I felt a rush of relief so intense it brought tears to my eyes. I threw my gear into the back seat and got in, locking the doors before starting the engine. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Even now, writing this, I can't explain what happened out there. But I know one thing for sure. I won't be camping alone again. I always loved the idea of camping. The simplicity of it, the way you could just escape the hum of daily life and get lost in nature. It was supposed to be a break from the monotony, a way to reconnect with myself. So when I finally had a free weekend, I decided to head out to a remote spot I'd found online. It was about a 3-hour drive from my apartment, deep in the woods, with a small lake nearby. The reviews mentioned the quietness of the place and how it felt like being in the middle of nowhere. Exactly what I was looking for. I packed light but made sure I had all the essentials. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold nights, food, water, a first aid kit, and my trusty Swiss Army knife. I'd gone camping before, though never completely alone. But this time I wanted solitude. No friends, no distractions, just me and nature. The drive out was uneventful, and by the time I reached the gravel road leading to the campsite, the sun was high in the sky. The trees were dense here, towering pines that seemed to block out the world beyond. The air smelled fresh, crisp, with a faint hint of pine resin. I pulled my car into the small clearing designated for campers, grabbed my gear, and set off down the trail. The walk to the campsite was about a mile, and it felt like I was leaving civilization behind with each step. The sound of my boots crunching on the dirt trail was the only noise apart from the occasional rustle of leaves or chirp of a bird. When I reached the site, I was pleased. It was as secluded as I'd hoped. The lake shimmered in the sunlight, framed by the trees that lined its edges. There was a fire pit, though it looked like it hadn't been used in a while, and enough flat ground to set up my tent comfortably. I spent the afternoon setting up camp. The tent went up easily, and I arranged my sleeping bag and gear inside. I collected some dry wood for a fire later and set up my small portable stove to cook dinner. By the time I was done, the sun was starting to dip below the treetops, casting long shadows across the ground. I sat by the lake for a while, just listening to the water lapping against the shore. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet I'd been craving. As darkness fell, I lit a small fire and cooked a simple meal. The stars began to appear, pinpricks of light in the vast, dark sky. I sat by the fire, letting its warmth seep into me as I sipped on a cup of instant coffee. The world felt far away and I was content. But that contentment didn't last. It started with a sound, a faint rustling in the underbrush just beyond the reach of the firelight. At first, I thought it was an animal, a raccoon or maybe a deer. I'd seen tracks earlier and knew wildlife was common here. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, more deliberate, like someone or something was moving through the woods with purpose. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trunks and branches, but I couldn't see anything. The sound stopped as soon as the light swept over the area. I told myself it was nothing, probably just the wind or an animal startled by the light, and went back to the fire. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to sleep, but the unease lingered. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear a faint noise, a crack, a rustle, a faint thud. Each time, I'd sit up and listen, heart pounding, but the sounds never repeated in the same way. It was as if whatever was out there knew when I was paying attention. At some point, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night, unsure of what had pulled me from sleep. The fire had died down to embers, and the tent was pitch black. I lay still, straining to hear. At first, there was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps on the gravel path leading to the campsite. Panic surged through me. I didn't want to move, didn't want to make a sound. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe another camper had wandered onto my site by mistake. But who would be out here at this hour? And why hadn't I heard a car or seen another person all day? The footsteps stopped just outside the tent. My heart was hammering so loudly I was sure whoever it was could hear it. I gripped my knife, the only weapon I had, and waited. The tent fabric rustled, as if someone was brushing against it. Then, nothing. I don't know how long I lay there, frozen, waiting for something to happen. Eventually, the sounds faded, and the night was silent again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped the tent cautiously and stepped out. The campsite looked the same as before, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I checked the perimeter, looking for footprints or signs that someone had been there, but found nothing. Still, I decided I'd had enough of solitude. I packed up my gear quickly, eager to leave. As I hiked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd hear a faint noise behind me, a branch snapping, leaves crunching. I'd stop and turn, but there was never anything there. The woods, so peaceful the day before, now felt oppressive, the trees looming over me like silent sentinels. When I finally reached the clearing where I'd parked, relief washed over me. But as I approached the car, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The driver's side door was open. I was sure I'd locked it. My keys were still in my pocket. So how? I approached cautiously, knife in hand. The car was empty, but the back seat had been ransacked. My spare jacket, a water bottle, and a pack of granola bars were gone. Whoever had been at my campsite had beaten me here. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out of the woods. The gravel road seemed to stretch on forever, but eventually, I reached the main highway. The tension in my chest eased slightly as I left the forest behind. I never went back to that campsite. I've camped since, but always in more populated areas, and never alone. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was just a homeless person looking for food, or a curious local playing a prank. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about those footsteps outside my tent and wonder what would have happened if I'd made a sound. The wind was crisp, the kind that bites at your face when the sun dips low. I had decided to camp alone this weekend, something I hadn't done in years. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. I just needed the quiet, the kind of quiet you only find in the middle of nowhere. I'd picked a spot deep in the woods near Lake Bellwater, far from the crowded campgrounds. The kind of place where you could feel like the only person alive. The hike-in was long, but I liked that. My pack was heavy with the essentials. A tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 2 days, a first aid kit, and a small flashlight with extra batteries. I had also brought a compact fishing rod, planning to catch dinner from the lake. The trail was narrow, winding through tall pines and dense underbrush. By the time I reached the clearing near the lake, the sun was already dipping behind the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. I set up camp quickly, feeling the chill settle in as the last light of day faded. The tent went up smoothly, and I dug a shallow pit for a small fire. Collecting kindling wasn't hard. The forest floor was littered with dry twigs and branches. Soon enough, a small fire crackled in front of me, its warmth a welcome relief. I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal of granola and jerky, too tired to bother fishing that night. The sound of the lake lapping at the shore and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind filled the air. It was peaceful, the kind of peace I'd been craving. The first night passed uneventfully. I woke early, the sky just beginning to lighten. The fire had burned out, leaving only a few glowing embers. I rekindled it, heating water for instant coffee. The plan for the day was simple: explore the area, maybe fish for a while, and just enjoy the solitude. After breakfast, I grabbed my fishing gear and headed down to the lake. The lake was stunning in the morning light, its surface smooth and reflective like a mirror. I cast my line and waited, watching as mist rose off the water. Time slipped by unnoticed until I felt the tug on the line. Dinner, I thought with a grin, reeling in a small but decent-sized trout. I caught a couple more before heading back to camp, pleased with the morning's work. The afternoon was spent exploring. I followed a game trail that snaked deeper into the forest, finding nothing particularly remarkable. Just trees, rocks, and the occasional chirp of a bird. But there was something about the air that felt heavier as I walked further from the lake. It wasn't anything tangible, just a feeling. I shrugged it off, reminding myself that I was alone in the middle of the woods. Sometimes your mind plays tricks on you in places like this. By late afternoon, I returned to camp. I cleaned the fish by the water's edge, using a small knife from my pack. The process was messy but satisfying. I cooked them over the fire, their aroma filling the air. Dinner was perfect, fresh, simple, and earned through my own effort. As I ate, the forest around me seemed to grow quieter, as if it too was settling in for the night. Darkness fell quickly, and with it came an unsettling silence, the kind that presses against your ears. I found myself straining to hear anything beyond the crackling of the fire. The rustle of leaves, the hoot of an owl, even the distant howl of a coyote, nothing came. It was unnerving. I've camped enough to know that forests are rarely ever silent. Animals stir, winds blow, branches creak. But this was empty. I told myself to relax. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe the animals had moved on, or maybe this area wasn't as active at night. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to call it a night, dousing the fire and crawling into my tent. The fabric walls felt thin, but they were a small comfort against the growing unease. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, keeping the flashlight close by. The sound came around midnight, a faint crunching, like someone stepping on dry leaves. My eyes snapped open, and I held my breath, listening. There it was again, closer this time. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. But the steps were too deliberate, too heavy. Not the kind of sound an animal makes. I stayed still, every muscle tense. The steps circled the tent, slow and steady. My heart pounded so loud I thought whoever or whatever was out there might hear it. I reached for the knife I'd used earlier, gripping it tightly. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the tent. I waited, expecting something to happen. A voice, a shadow, anything. But there was nothing. Just silence again, as heavy as before. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I didn't move, barely even breathed. Finally, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a restless sleep. Morning came, and with it a tentative sense of relief. The sun filtered through the tent fabric, chasing away the fears of the night. I unzipped the door cautiously, peering out. The campsite looked undisturbed. No footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it had been an animal after all. I spent the day trying to shake off the unease. I packed up camp slowly, double-checking everything. My plan was to head back to the trailhead, cutting the trip short. As much as I wanted to convince myself it was nothing, the memory of those footsteps was too vivid. The hike back felt longer than it should have. The trail seemed unfamiliar in places, though I knew it was the same one I'd taken in. I blamed it on my nerves, on the sleepless night. But as the day wore on, the feeling that something was wrong grew stronger. At one point, I stopped to rest, leaning against a tree. That's when I noticed it. A faint smell, like something rotting. It wasn't overpowering, but it was there, carried on the breeze. I looked around, seeing nothing unusual. The forest was still empty, eerily so. I hurried on, the smell lingering in my mind. The trailhead came into view as the sun dipped low again. Relief washed over me. My car was parked where I'd left it, a welcome sight. I loaded up my gear quickly, eager to put distance between me and the woods. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone standing at the edge of the trees. But there was nothing. I told myself I'd overreacted, let my imagination get the better of me. But as I sit here now, back in the safety of my home, I can't shake the feeling that I was being watched out there. Not by an animal, but by something human. The sound of those footsteps, the silence, the smell, they're etched into my memory. I don't think I'll ever camp alone again. The sound of gravel crunching under the tires filled the air as I pulled my car into the campsite. I had planned this trip for weeks, a solo escape to the quiet of the woods, away from the noise and demands of daily life. The drive itself had been therapeutic, winding through long stretches of dense trees, the occasional breaks revealing glimpses of rivers and valleys. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping low, its orange glow filtering through the pines. The campsite was exactly how I'd imagined it. A small clearing surrounded by towering trees, the ground carpeted in soft pine needles. I parked the car, stepped out, and stretched. The air smelled earthy and clean, with a faint hint of wood smoke carried from distant campers. I couldn't see anyone else, though, and that was exactly how I wanted it. This spot was secluded, far enough from the main camping area to feel isolated, but not so remote that I couldn't find my way back if needed. I began unpacking my gear. A sturdy tent, sleeping bag, food supplies, and a small cooler. Setting up the tent took longer than expected. The ground was uneven, and I had to clear a few rocks and sticks before it was stable. By the time I was done, the sky was fading into a deep blue, and the first stars were blinking into view. I built a small fire using some dry wood I had brought with me and lit it with a match. The flames caught quickly, crackling and casting flickering shadows across the campsite. Dinner was simple, a can of chili heated over the fire. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet. There was something calming about being out here alone, with only the sounds of the forest for company. The rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, and the occasional chirp of crickets created a soothing soundtrack. As the fire burned down to embers, I decided to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, zipped up the flap, and nestled into my sleeping bag. The ground was firm but not uncomfortable, and the steady chirping of insects lulled me to sleep. I woke abruptly sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I couldn't tell what had disturbed me. The fire outside had long since gone out, and the only light came from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the tent fabric. I lay still, listening. The forest was quiet, too quiet. The usual hum of insects had stopped, and an uneasy stillness had taken its place. Then I heard it, a faint rustling, like footsteps crunching through the underbrush. My heart started pounding. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon scavenging for food. But the sound wasn't sporadic. It was deliberate, steady. Someone or something was moving outside my tent. I stayed perfectly still, my mind racing. Should I call out? Unzip the tent and look? The rustling grew louder, closer. Whoever it was, they were circling the campsite. My breathing was shallow, and I could feel sweat trickling down my back despite the cool night air. Then the sound stopped, and the silence was worse than the noise. I strained my ears, trying to pick up any hint of movement, but there was nothing. Minutes passed, maybe longer. I didn't dare move, afraid that even the slightest sound would give away my presence. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming into the tent. I sat up, my body stiff from lying in the same position for so long. Outside, the campsite looked undisturbed. The fire pit was cold, the cooler untouched. I told myself it had been my imagination, a trick of the mind brought on by the unfamiliar setting. After breakfast, I decided to explore the area. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, with sunlight streaming through the trees and illuminating the ferns below. I followed a trail that led to a small stream, the sound of running water soothing my nerves. I spent the day hiking, taking photos, and enjoying the solitude. By the time I returned to the campsite, I felt more at ease. Whatever had happened the night before, it was probably just an animal. That night, I built another fire and sat by it, watching the flames dance. The forest seemed more alive now, the sounds of nocturnal creatures filling the air. I tried to convince myself that everything was fine, but I couldn't shake the unease that lingered from the night before. I decided to keep a flashlight and my utility knife within arm's reach, just in case. I fell asleep more easily this time, the day's hike having worn me out. But once again, I woke in the middle of the night. This time it was different. I didn't hear footsteps or rustling. Instead, it was a soft tapping sound, like someone lightly drumming their fingers against the side of the tent. My heart felt like it stopped. The tapping was deliberate, rhythmic.
Top, top, top.
It moved slowly around the tent, pausing every few seconds before continuing. I grabbed the flashlight and knife, my hands trembling. The tapping stopped. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. Then, without warning, the tent shook violently, as if someone had grabbed it and was trying to tear it down. I screamed, instinct taking over as I fumbled with the zipper and burst out of the tent, flashlight beam sweeping wildly. The campsite was empty. The fire pit, the trees, the car parked a few feet away. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. My breathing was ragged, my pulse pounding in my ears. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, scanning the darkness, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound. I didn't go back to sleep. Instead, I sat by the car with the flashlight in one hand and the knife in the other, waiting for dawn. When the first light of morning broke through the trees, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. I didn't care about the carefully planned itinerary or the fact that I'd driven hours to get here. I just wanted to leave. As I loaded the last of my things into the car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the ground, right where my tent had been, were footprints. Not animal tracks, but human ones, barefoot and larger than mine. They circled the campsite, overlapping in some places, as if whoever had made them had been pacing. My stomach churned. I hadn't imagined it. Someone had been there. I got in the car and started the engine, the sound breaking the morning silence. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something emerge from the trees. But the road remained empty. I don't know who or what was out there that night, and I'm not sure I want to. I haven't been camping since, and I don't think I ever will again. The woods may be beautiful, but they're also vast and full of shadows, and some shadows are best left undisturbed. I was never the type to believe in signs or omens, but as I turned onto the narrow dirt road that led to the cabin, an uneasy feeling settled over me. The drive up had been uneventful, just miles of empty highways and thick forest. The cabin belonged to my uncle, who had left it to me in his will. It was secluded, tucked away in the Appalachian Mountains, and according to the lawyer, in need of some repairs. I had decided to spend a weekend there to assess its condition and figure out what to do with it. The road twisted and turned, barely wide enough for my car. Branches scraped against the sides, and the afternoon sun struggled to penetrate the dense canopy of trees. Finally, the cabin came into view. It was smaller than I had imagined, with weathered wooden walls and a sagging roof. A single window faced the road, its glass smudged and opaque. The air felt heavier here, as though the trees were pressing in closer. The first thing I noticed when I stepped out of the car was the silence. It wasn't the peaceful kind. It was the kind that made you realize how far away you were from civilization. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own breathing. The cabin's front door hung slightly ajar, creaking as the wind nudged it back and forth. I hesitated before stepping onto the porch, the wooden boards groaning under my weight. Inside, the air was musty, and the dim light barely illuminated the interior. The furniture was sparse, a couch that had seen better days, a wooden table with one chair, and a stone fireplace filled with ash. Cobwebs draped the corners of the room, and the floor was littered with dead leaves that had blown in through the open door. I set my bag down and walked to the window, wiping the glass with my sleeve to get a better look outside. All I could see were trees. I spent the next couple of hours cleaning. It was a slow process, made worse by the oppressive silence. Every sound I made, a broom scraping against the floor, a cabinet door creaking, seemed amplified. As the sun began to set, I decided to check the back of the cabin. There was a small shed a few yards away, its door padlocked. Next to it, a rusty axe leaned against a chopping block, the wood splintered and worn. The ground was uneven, littered with twigs and patches of moss. After dinner, which consisted of a sandwich and a bottle of water I'd brought with me, I lit a fire in the fireplace. The flickering light cast strange shadows on the walls, making the cabin feel even smaller. I tried to read, but I couldn't focus. My thoughts kept drifting to the shed. Why was it locked? What could be inside? I told myself it didn't matter. The shed wasn't going anywhere, and I could deal with it in the morning. Sleep didn't come easily. The mattress on the bed was lumpy, and the old wooden frame creaked with every movement. The silence outside had been replaced by the occasional rustling of leaves or the snap of a twig. I told myself it was just animals, but each noise made my pulse quicken. Around midnight, I finally drifted off, only to be jolted awake by a loud thud. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear. The fire had burned down to embers, and the room was dark except for the faint glow. Another thud, this time louder. It was coming from outside. I grabbed the flashlight I'd left on the table and crept to the window. Shining the beam into the darkness, I saw nothing but trees. The sound came again, and I realized it was coming from the direction of the shed. My first instinct was to stay inside, to lock the door and wait for morning, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed the rusty axe from outside the cabin and made my way to the shed. The padlock was intact, but the door had been dented, as though something had slammed against it. I shone the flashlight around but saw nothing unusual. I went back inside, bolted the door, and sat by the dying fire until morning. Whatever had happened, I convinced myself it wasn't worth worrying about. The next day, I decided to break the padlock on the shed. Using the axe as a makeshift hammer, I managed to crack it open after several attempts. The inside was disappointing. Old gardening tools, a wheelbarrow with a broken wheel, and a pile of tarps. But then I noticed something odd. The floor of the shed was made of wooden planks, unlike the dirt floor I had expected. One of the planks was loose. Underneath, I found a small compartment containing a metal box. It was locked, but the key was taped to the underside of the lid. Inside the box were papers, letters, receipts, and what looked like a map. The map marked a spot about a mile from the cabin. There was no explanation, just an X drawn in red ink. Against my better judgment, I decided to check it out. I packed a small bag with water and a flashlight, then set off into the woods. The forest was dense, the trees towering above me like silent sentinels. The map wasn't detailed, but the terrain wasn't too difficult to navigate. After about an hour, I found the spot. It was a clearing, smaller than I had expected, with a shallow hole in the center. The hole looked like it had been dug up recently. I didn't have a shovel, so I used my hands to scrape away the loose dirt. Buried beneath was a metal canister, sealed tightly. I opened it to find a stack of old photographs and a journal. The photos were black and white, showing a group of people I didn't recognize. They were standing in front of the cabin, smiling, but something about their expressions seemed off. The journal was even more unsettling. The entries were dated decades ago and described strange occurrences at the cabin. Missing tools, footprints in the mud, and the feeling of being watched. One entry caught my attention. It mentioned the shed and the locked compartment. If you're reading this, it said, "Stay away from the clearing. They don't like it when you dig." I felt a chill run down my spine. I stuffed the photos and journal back into the canister and hurried back to the cabin. The sun was setting, and the woods seemed darker than before. Every sound made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. When I finally reached the cabin, I locked the door and shoved the couch against it for good measure. I spent the night by the fire, unable to sleep. The journal sat on the table, its leather cover worn and cracked. I debated whether to read more or burn it. In the morning, I decided to leave. Whatever secrets the cabin held, they weren't mine to uncover. As I packed my things, I couldn't help but glance at the journal one last time. I tucked it into my bag, thinking I'd deal with it later. The drive back felt longer, and the tension didn't leave me until I was miles away from the cabin. When I finally reached home, I placed the journal and photographs in a drawer and locked it. I never went back to the cabin, and I eventually sold it to a local buyer. Sometimes I think about the clearing and the people in the photographs. I've wondered if I should dig deeper, try to find out who they were or what happened there. But every time I consider it, I remember the journal's warning, "They don't like it when you dig," so I let it be. Some things are better left buried.